Hey guys, tonight we begin a journey into a world where women bathed in the milk of 500 donkeys, where a single pearl cost more than a palace, where beauty routines could kill you, and where the most restricted women in society somehow held the keys to extraordinary luxury. Picture this: a Roman woman who legally could not vote, could not hold office, could not even represent herself in court, and yet she owned jewelry worth millions, controlled vast estates, and walked through marble halls wearing silk that cost more than most people earned in a lifetime. How? How did women who were considered perpetual dependents become some of the most luxurious, powerful, and fascinating figures of the ancient world? Tonight, we're going to uncover what luxury truly meant for women in the Roman Empire, and trust me, it is far stranger, more extravagant, and more complex than you ever imagined. Before we step into those marble corridors together, I would love it if you could take just a moment to subscribe to the channel and hit that like button, but only if you genuinely enjoy what we explore together. I am curious, where are you watching from right now? What time is it where you are? Drop a comment and let me know. Now, dim those lights, get comfortable, maybe turn on a soft fan or some gentle background sound, and let your mind drift back 2,000 years with me. Let us begin. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine Rome in the year 150. Not the Rome of gladiators and battles, though those existed. Not the Rome of senators and laws, though those were everywhere. Instead, imagine the Rome of a woman named Julia. She wakes in a villa outside the city, sunlight filtering through silk curtains imported from China, curtains that cost more than the entire annual salary of a Roman soldier. The room smells of roses and frankincense. Marble columns frame the doorway. The floor beneath her feet is a mosaic so intricate that it depicts every feather on a peacock's tail. And Julia? She has just turned 20. She cannot vote. She cannot hold political office. Her father arranged her marriage when she was 14. By law, she's under the authority of a man, first her father, now her husband. And yet, this morning, 3 enslaved women will spend 4 hours preparing her face alone. She owns more jewelry than most modern museums. Her morning bath will use water heated by a sophisticated underground system, scented with oils from Egypt. Her breakfast will include delicacies from 3 different continents. This is the paradox at the heart of Roman women's lives. Legal restrictions that seem suffocating by modern standards, and yet access to luxury that would make contemporary billionaires envious. How do we reconcile these two realities? How did women navigate a world that both limited them and lavished them with extraordinary wealth? The answer lies in understanding what the Roman Empire truly was at its peak. Between the years 100 and 200 of the Common Era, the Roman Empire controlled territory stretching from Britain in the north to Egypt in the south, from Spain in the west to Mesopotamia in the east. This was not just political control. This was economic domination on a scale the world had rarely seen. Trade routes connected Rome to Persia, to India, to China itself. Ships crossed the Mediterranean carrying silk, spices, precious stones, exotic animals, rare woods, perfumes, and luxuries beyond imagination. And all of this wealth, all of this abundance, flowed into Rome like rivers into an ocean. But here is what most people miss. This wealth did not just enrich the empire, it transformed what it meant to live well, particularly for women of the elite classes. You see, Roman society had a concept called cultus. We do not have a perfect translation in English. It encompasses makeup, perfume, jewelry, clothing, grooming, personal presentation, everything that went into adorning oneself. And for wealthy Roman women, cultus was not vanity. It was power. It was identity. It was one of the few areas where women could express autonomy, where they could control something in a world that legally controlled them. Let me paint you a clearer picture. Imagine you are visiting Rome for the first time. You are walking down the Via Sacra, the Sacred Way, the most important street in the entire empire. Temples line the road, crowds bustle, merchants shout, and then you see her, a wealthy Roman matron being carried in a litter by 6 enslaved men. The litter itself is adorned with gold, but it is the woman who captures your attention. Her skin is luminous, almost white, painted with preparations that took hours to apply. Her hair is piled high in elaborate curls, held in place with pins made of ivory and gold. She wears a necklace of emeralds, each stone the size of a grape, imported from Egypt. Her earrings are shaped like boats, crafted from gold so pure it glows in the sunlight. Pearls dangle from them, pearls that came all the way from the Persian Gulf. Around her wrist are 3 bracelets, spiraling snakes made of solid gold. On every finger except the middle she wears rings, 16 rings in total, each set with a different precious stone. Her dress is dyed with Tyrian purple, a colour so expensive that it literally cost more than gold by weight. And as she passes, the air fills with perfume, heavy and sweet, masking, you would learn later, the smell of the lead-based makeup on her face. This woman is not unusual. Among the patrician class, the old aristocratic families of Rome, this level of adornment was expected. Required even. Because luxury was not just about pleasure. It was about social signalling. It announced who you were, where you belonged, what connections you had. To appear in public without jewellery was almost unthinkable for a woman of status. It would be like showing up to an important modern event in your pyjamas. You would be noticed, certainly, but not in a good way. Now, I want to introduce you to some real women who lived this life. Women whose names echo through history, not because they held official power, but because their luxury, their influence, and their complexity were impossible to ignore. Let us start with Poppaea Sabina. You might not know her name, but her bathing habits became legendary. Poppaea was the wife of Emperor Nero, and she was obsessed with beauty. Ancient sources tell us that she travelled with an entourage that included 500 donkeys. Why? Because she bathed exclusively in donkey milk, believing it kept her skin soft and luminous. 500 donkeys. Can you imagine the logistics, the cost, the sheer extravagance? But Poppaea was not content with just bathing. She created her own beauty products. One of her famous inventions was a face mask she called Poppiana, made from donkey milk mixed with bread dough, worn overnight. Did it work? Who knows? But the wealthy women of Rome copied her obsessively. Then there was Valeria Messalina, third wife of Emperor Claudius. Messalina was notorious, scandalous, talked about in whispers and legends. But beyond the scandals, she was also a woman who wielded luxury like a weapon. She owned jewellery collections that were catalogued and guarded like state treasures. She hosted banquets where the entertainment cost more than some provinces paid in annual taxes. She understood something crucial. In a world where women could not hold official power, luxury was a form of currency. It bought influence, attention, respect, and fear. And Julia Domna, wife of Emperor Septimius Severus, who lived in the late 2nd and early 3rd centuries. Julia was not just a luxury-loving empress. She was educated, interested in philosophy, and she became known as Mother of the Senate and the Fatherland, an extraordinary title for a woman. But she also understood presentation. Her portraits show her wearing elaborate jewelry, her hair styled in the latest fashion. She knew that looking the part was essential to being taken seriously. But here is something fascinating. This luxury, this access to extraordinary wealth, was not universally celebrated, even in Rome. There were laws, actual legislation, attempting to control women's spending on luxury goods. The most famous was the Oppian Law, passed in 215 before the Common Era, during the desperate days of the Second Punic War when Hannibal was devastating Italy. The law restricted the amount of gold women could own, limited their wearing of multicolored clothing, and forbade them from riding in carriages within cities. The reasoning: the state needed money for war. Luxury was seen as wasteful, distracting, even unpatriotic. But here is the remarkable part. 20 years later, in 195 before the Common Era, the war was over. Rome was wealthy again, and Roman women had had enough. They took to the streets. Yes, you heard that right. In ancient Rome, women organized a public protest. They filled the forum, they blocked the streets, they demanded the repeal of the Oppian Law. Male politicians gave speeches against them. The famous Cato the Elder railed against women's extravagance, warning that allowing women too much luxury would lead to moral decay. But the women persisted, and they won. The Oppian Law was repealed. Women could once again wear their jewelry, their colourful clothes, their symbols of status and identity without legal restriction. Think about that for a moment. 2,000 years ago, in a society we often imagine as completely patriarchal, women organized, protested, and successfully changed legislation. Why? Because luxury mattered. Because presentation mattered. Because in a world that restricted their official power, women found power in other forms. So what does all of this tell us? It tells us that Roman women's relationship with luxury was complicated, nuanced, and far more interesting than simple stereotypes allow. They were not passive ornaments. They were not just victims of a patriarchal system, though that system certainly existed and restricted them. They were active participants in a culture of display, using the tools available to them, navigating restrictions, finding agency where they could. And the luxury they embraced, the extravagance that sometimes scandalized even their contemporaries, was part of how they claimed space in a world that officially denied them so much. As you drift towards sleep tonight, hold that image in your mind. A Roman woman, adorned in gold and silk and precious stones, walking through a marble hall. She cannot vote, she cannot hold office, but she commands attention, respect, and yes, a certain kind of power. She's a paradox, a contradiction, a fascinating window into a world that was stranger and more complex than we usually imagine. And we're just beginning to understand her story. In our next part, we will step into her morning routine, into that intimate space where she prepares her face, where beauty becomes a ritual lasting hours, where toxic ingredients mix with artistry, and where the pursuit of the perfect appearance could literally be deadly. So take a deep breath, let your mind rest in ancient Rome for just a little longer, and when you are ready, we will discover together the extraordinary, dangerous, and utterly fascinating world of Roman cosmetics and beauty rituals. Now let me take you somewhere most people never get to go. Behind closed doors, into a small, intimate room in a Roman villa where men are not permitted to enter. It is dawn, perhaps 6 in the morning by our modern counting, and we're about to witness something extraordinary. A beauty ritual that will consume the next 4 hours. 4 hours before breakfast, before the day truly begins, just to prepare a face. The room is warm, heated by the hypocaust system beneath the floor. Sunlight filters through high windows, and there, sitting on a low stool, is a woman we'll call Claudia. She's 30 years old, the wife of a senator, and she is just woken. Her face is bare, her hair loose, and surrounding her are 3 enslaved women, specialists trained in the art of cultus. They are called cosmetae, and they are about to transform their mistress into the Roman ideal of beauty. But here is what you need to understand before we go further. This transformation is not optional. It is not about personal preference or having fun with makeup like we might think of it today. This is about survival in a society where appearance is everything, where a woman's value is constantly judged by how well she presents herself, where looking the part means maintaining your family's status, your husband's reputation, your own precarious position in a ruthlessly competitive social world. So what did Roman beauty look like? What was the ideal they were all chasing? Close your eyes and forget everything you know about modern beauty standards. Forget the tanned skin, the athletic bodies, the bold makeup of contemporary culture. In Rome, pale skin was everything. Deathly pale, almost white. Why? Because pale skin meant you did not work outside. It meant you did not labor in the fields like a slave or a peasant. It meant you were wealthy enough to stay indoors, protected from the sun. Pale skin was the ultimate status symbol. Along with that came specific body ideals. Small breasts were preferred. Large breasts were actually mocked in Roman literature as signs of old age or low class. Wide hips, on the other hand, were desirable, suggesting fertility and health. A full abdomen was considered attractive, showing that you were well-fed, prosperous. It is fascinating, is it not? How beauty standards are so completely cultural, so tied to time and place. But let us return to Claudia and her morning ritual. The first step before any makeup is applied is cleansing. One of the cosmetae brings forward a bowl containing a mixture that, honestly, you are not going to believe. Sweat collected from sheep's wool, placenta, ground oyster shells, sulfur, animal urine. Yes, you heard that correctly. This is the face mask. This is what wealthy Roman women applied to achieve that coveted, smooth, blemish-free complexion. Can you imagine? And remember, these are the wealthy women, the ones who could afford the best treatments. The poor could not afford even these horrifying ingredients. Claudia sits patiently as the mask is spread across her face. It smells terrible, absolutely foul. Which is why, later, she will drench herself in perfume, layer upon layer, trying to mask the smell that lingers. The mask is left to dry for perhaps 30 minutes while the cosmetae prepare the next stage. During this time, Claudia cannot speak much, cannot smile. The mask would crack. She simply waits, still, while her face transforms from whatever she naturally looks like into what society demands she look like. Now, while the mask is working, let me tell you about the most dangerous ingredient in the Roman beauty arsenal. Lead, white lead, specifically. It was called cerussa, and it was the foundation of Roman makeup, literally. Mixed with chalk and sometimes tin, white lead created an incredibly smooth, incredibly white finish on the skin. It looked flawless. It looked exactly like the porcelain complexion that Roman society valued above all else. And it was slowly killing the women who used it. Lead is a poison, a particularly insidious one. It does not kill you immediately. Instead, it accumulates in your body over years. It causes neurological damage, kidney failure, infertility, mental deterioration. Roman women who used white lead makeup regularly would have suffered headaches, fatigue, tremors, memory problems. Some historians believe that the widespread use of lead cosmetics contributed to actual health crises among the Roman elite. But here is the thing. They knew it was harmful. Ancient writers warned against it. Doctors cautioned women, and yet they kept using it. Because the social pressure to look a certain way was more powerful than the fear of slow poisoning. Let me paint you a picture of just how desperate this pursuit could be. There is a recipe that survives from the Roman poet Ovid. Yes, the same Ovid who wrote the Metamorphoses. He wrote a poem called Medicamina Faciae Feminae, which translates roughly to cosmetics for the female face. In it, he gives recipes for skin whitening. One involves pale lupins, windy beans, and white lead, ground together and mixed with honey. The instructions are precise. The promises are extravagant. Smooth skin, radiant complexion, everything a Roman woman could want. Ovid, at least, was one of the few male writers who encouraged cosmetics use, who wrote about beauty preparation without dripping scorn. But he was the exception. Most male Roman writers were absolutely savage about women wearing makeup. The poet Juvenal wrote mockingly about women who used antimony for their eyes, describing their cosmetic routines as symptoms of moral decline and excessive luxury. The philosopher Seneca the Elder complained that women who wore silken cosmetics were immodest, essentially immoral. Even Cicero, the great orator, famously said, "The right scent for a woman is none at all," criticizing the heavy perfumes women wore, which, by the way, they wore specifically to cover the smell of their makeup. So in a way, men created a circular problem. Society demands women look perfect. Perfect requires terrible-smelling ingredients. Women cover the smell with perfume. Men complain about the perfume. You cannot win. But back to Claudia. The mask is removed. Her face is washed with water, gently patted dry with soft linen cloths. Now comes the foundation. One of the cosmetae mixes white lead with chalk on a small marble palette. The mixture is thinned with water until it reaches the perfect consistency. Then, using a flat spatula or sometimes just fingertips, she begins to apply it to Claudia's face, slowly, carefully, building up layers. The goal is complete coverage, an even white surface that hides any natural skin tone, any imperfections, any hint that there is a real face underneath. This process alone can take an hour. Now, what about other parts of the face? The eyes were crucial. Roman women loved dramatic eyes, dark, lined, exotic-looking. The primary material was kohl, a substance that had been used for thousands of years, inherited from Egyptian beauty practices. Cleopatra had brought the smoky eye to Rome when she visited in 46 before the Common Era, and Roman women embraced it eagerly. But what was kohl made of? It varied. The wealthy used antimony, a metallic element ground into a fine powder. Some used soot, scraped from oil lamps. This was the poor woman's version, easily accessible but less prestigious. The absolute elite might use saffron mixed with other ingredients. Saffron, the expensive spice, as eyeliner. Only in Rome. The application required precision. Using a thin stick or needle, the cosmeti would line Claudia's eyes, creating definition, making them appear larger, more luminous. Sometimes the eyebrows were darkened too, shaped and defined. The goal was not natural. The goal was striking, noticeable, impressive. Think of it less like modern everyday makeup and more like stage makeup, designed to be seen across a room, to make an impact. And the lips. Oh, the lips. Red lips were fashionable, a sign of youth and vitality. But how did they achieve that red? Brace yourself. Bromine, beetlejuice, literally crushed insects, beeswax for consistency, henna for colour, and sometimes, particularly for the wealthy who could afford imports, red lead. Yes, lead again. This time for the lips. A particularly dangerous choice since it would inevitably be ingested. Women were literally poisoning themselves slowly for beauty. For the cheeks, for that flush of colour that suggests health and vitality, Roman women had options. The wealthy imported red ochre from Belgium, a naturally occurring iron oxide that produced a beautiful, long-lasting red colour. Some used rose petals crushed into paste. Others used wine dregs, the sediment left at the bottom of wine jars, which provided a deep, rich colour. And then there were the truly bizarre options. Crocodile dung. Yes, imported from Egypt at enormous cost. Or mulberry juice, or even red lead again, that dangerous, toxic and unfortunately very effective pigment. But here is the part that almost broke my brain when I first learned about it. All of this makeup, all of these carefully applied layers, were not permanent. In the hot Mediterranean climate, in the summer heat of Rome, makeup melted. It ran. It smeared. Ancient writers mocked women whose rouge ran down their cheeks in streaks during banquets. Imagine spending 4 hours getting ready, only to have your face literally melt in public. The poet Martial wrote scathingly about this, using it as evidence of women's foolishness. But what choice did they have? Society demanded perfection, and imperfect tools were all that were available. So Claudia and millions like her went through this process again and again, multiple times a day, sometimes, reapplying, touching up, maintaining that flawless facade. And they did it with the help of the cosmetae, those skilled enslaved women who knew every secret, every technique, every trick for making their mistresses look like the Roman ideal. The most talented cosmetae were extremely valuable, commanding high prices if they were sold, given positions of relative privilege within households. Their expertise was recognized, even if their personhood was not. Now I want you to think about something. Modern makeup artists often talk about how makeup can be empowering, how it lets you express yourself, control your presentation, feel confident. Was it the same for Roman women? Or was it something darker, a burden, an exhausting requirement that consumed hours every day? The answer, I think, is both. Yes, it was a requirement, socially mandated, often criticized, sometimes literally dangerous. But it was also one of the few areas where women had control. They chose their cosmetae, they decided which products to use, they experimented with new techniques, they created trends. In a world that restricted so much of their lives, cultus was theirs. And despite the male writers sneering and criticizing, women persisted. They kept applying the makeup, they kept importing the expensive ingredients, they kept spending the hours day after day, year after year. Why? Because it mattered. Because presentation was power. Because in a world where your worth was constantly judged by appearance, you did what you had to do to survive and thrive. As Claudia's face is finally complete, white and smooth and dramatic, she stands. She is ready now for the next phase of her morning ritual. Her face is done, but we are nowhere near finished. Because in Rome, beauty was not just about the face. It was about the whole body, about hair that took as much effort as the face, about rituals and potions and masks that promised eternal youth. And some of those preparations were even stranger, even more elaborate than what we have seen so far. So stay with me as we move deeper into the world of Roman beauty, as we discover the science, if we can call it that, behind their skincare, as we meet more women who were willing to do almost anything to maintain their appearance in a world that valued beauty above almost everything else for women. The story only gets more fascinating from here. There is a question I want you to consider. What would you be willing to do for perfect skin? Would you spend $100 on a cream? 1,000? Would you try something strange, something unconventional, if it promised to erase wrinkles, heal blemishes, restore youth? Now let me ask you something even more challenging. What if that treatment involved bathing in animal milk? or smearing ashes from burned snails across your face, or sleeping with a mask made of bread dough and bodily fluids? Would you do it? Because Roman women did, and not just any women. The wealthiest, most powerful, most educated women of the ancient world believed absolutely in treatments that sound, to our modern ears, completely insane. What we're about to explore is different from what we just discussed. The makeup we talked about was temporary, reapplied daily, meant to be seen. But underneath that makeup, Roman women were waging a deeper battle, against wrinkles, against blemishes, against the inevitable march of time on their faces. They had an entire arsenal of skincare treatments, potions, masks and rituals that were meant to preserve, to heal, to improve the skin itself, not just cover it up but actually change it. And some of these treatments have been proven by modern science to actually work, while others were probably just expensive ways to damage your face. Let us start with the woman who became the absolute icon of Roman skincare luxury. We mentioned her briefly before, but now we need to understand just how far she went. Poppaea Sabina, wife of Emperor Nero, born around 30 of the Common Era, died in 65, supposedly kicked to death by Nero himself during a fit of rage, though some historians debate this. But before that tragic end, Poppaea lived a life of such extravagant beauty obsession that her name became synonymous with luxury skincare for centuries afterward. Here is what ancient sources tell us. Poppaea never bathed in regular water. Never. She bathed exclusively in the milk of donkeys, not goats, not cows, donkeys specifically, and not just a little bit of milk added to bath water. She required enough milk to fill an entire bathing pool. Do you have any idea how much milk that requires? How many donkeys? The Roman naturalist Pliny the Elder, writing in his Natural History around 77 of the Common Era, tells us that Poppaea travelled with a herd of 500 she-donkeys specifically for this purpose. 500. Wherever she went, they went. Imagine the logistics, the cost, the staff required to manage 500 donkeys, to milk them, to transport the milk, to fill the baths. It is almost incomprehensible. But why donkeys specifically? Why not just any milk? The Romans believed that donkey milk had special properties, and here is the fascinating part. They were not entirely wrong. Modern analysis has shown that donkey milk has a composition remarkably similar to human breast milk. It is rich in vitamins, particularly vitamin C. It contains proteins and fatty acids that are genuinely good for skin. It has anti-inflammatory properties. So when Poppaea bathed in donkey milk, was it pure superstition, or was there actual benefit? The answer is probably both. The milk likely did make her skin softer, smoother, more hydrated. But the extravagance, the 500 donkeys, the exclusivity, that was about status and luxury as much as actual skincare. And Poppaea did not stop at baths. She created her own skincare line, if we can call it that. Her most famous invention was a face mask that became so popular it was named after her. Poppiana. The recipe survives in ancient sources. Donkey milk, obviously, mixed with bread dough, specifically bread made from the finest wheat flour. The two ingredients were combined into a thick paste, then applied to the face at night and left on while she slept. Can you imagine trying to sleep with bread dough on your face? How sticky it must have been, how uncomfortable. But Roman women swore by it. The wealthy ones, anyway. The ones who could afford donkey milk and fine flour. The poor had their own versions, cheaper substitutes, but nothing quite matched the prestige of authentic Poppiana. Now, what about wrinkles? This was perhaps the greatest enemy of Roman women. In a society that valued youth so highly, that married women off at 12 or 14, wrinkles were catastrophic. They signalled age, declining value, the loss of beauty power. So women fought back with every weapon available. And some of those weapons were surprisingly sophisticated. Swan fat. This was considered one of the best wrinkle remedies available. Swans, those elegant white birds, their fat was collected, rendered down, and applied to the skin as a smoothing agent. Was it effective? Well, animal fats do have moisturizing properties. They create a barrier on the skin that locks in moisture, which can temporarily reduce the appearance of fine lines. So yes, swan fat probably worked, at least a little. It was also expensive, difficult to obtain, and therefore appropriately prestigious. Goose grease was another option, more accessible than swan fat but still effective. The Romans understood, perhaps instinctively, that fat and oil were essential for skin care. They did not have the scientific vocabulary we have now, words like lipids and emollients, but they knew that certain substances made skin softer, smoother, more supple, and animal fats were some of their best tools. Then there was lanolin. Do you know what lanolin is? It is the grease that naturally coats sheep's wool, a waxy substance that waterproofs the fleece, and it is, even today, used in skincare products. The Romans discovered that lanolin had remarkable softening properties. They collected it by processing raw wool, extracting the grease, and using it as a base for various creams and ointments. So when we talked earlier about sheep's wool sweat in face masks, this is what they were after. Not the sweat exactly, but the lanolin. And they were right. Lanolin is genuinely beneficial for skin, but not everything Roman women used was benign or effective. Take crocodile excrement, for instance. Yes, we mentioned it briefly as a rouge ingredient, but it was also used in various skincare preparations. Why? The theory, as far as we can reconstruct it, was that crocodiles had incredibly tough, durable skin. Therefore, products derived from crocodiles might transfer some of that durability to human skin. The logic is sympathetic magic, not science. And the reality is that crocodile excrement had no beneficial properties whatsoever. It was just expensive, exotic, and therefore desirable. What about actual skin problems? Acne, for instance. Did Roman women suffer from it? Of course they did. Hormones do not care what century you live in, and they had treatments. Some were reasonable. Barley flour mixed with butter, applied as a poultice to blemishes. The barley provided gentle exfoliation. The butter moisturized. It probably helped, at least a little. Lentils ground into a paste with honey were another option. Honey, we now know, has genuine antibacterial properties. So a honey-based acne treatment? Actually not a terrible idea. But they also used lead, that dangerous toxic metal for acne. Because lead did dry out skin, did seem to shrink blemishes, at least temporarily. And so despite the warnings, despite the known dangers, women kept using it. The short-term cosmetic benefit outweighed, in their minds, the long-term health risks. Sun damage was another concern. Remember, pale skin was ideal, which meant avoiding the sun, but damage still happened. Time spent in gardens, brief trips outside, accumulated exposure. How did they treat it? Ashes from burned snails. I know how that sounds, but stay with me. Snail slime, snail secretion, is today used in high-end skincare products. It contains glycolic acid, a compound that helps with skin regeneration. Now, the Romans were not using fresh snail slime. They were burning the snails and using the ashes. Did it work? Probably not as well as fresh secretion would have, but the instinct, the idea that snails had something beneficial to offer skin, was not entirely wrong. let me tell you about one of the most extraordinary archaeological discoveries related to Roman cosmetics. In the year 2003, archaeologists were excavating near the River Thames in London, on the site of what had once been a Roman temple, and they found something that stopped them cold. A small cylindrical tin container, measuring about 6 centimetres by 5 centimetres, tightly sealed. When they carefully opened it, they found a pungent-smelling white cream, still preserved after nearly 2,000 years. And visible in the cream were finger marks. The last person to use this product, some Roman woman living in Londinium almost 2 millennia ago, had pressed her fingers into the lid to scoop out the cream. Those finger marks survived, frozen in time, a direct physical connection to an ancient woman's daily life. The Museum of London curator who opened the container said it appeared to be very much like an ointment, and whoever used it last had applied it to something with their fingers. But what was it? What was this cream made of? Modern scientific analysis revealed something fascinating. The base was animal fat, which we would expect, but mixed with the fat was starch, which would have created a powdery finish on the skin, and tin. Tin, a metal. This was unexpected because tin is not mentioned in any surviving written source as a cosmetic ingredient. Written recipes talk about lead, about chalk, about various minerals, but never tin. Yet here was physical proof that someone, some skilled cosmete or perhaps the woman herself, had experimented with tin as a skin whitener, and it would have worked, creating a pale, opaque finish similar to lead but potentially less toxic. The container itself was made almost entirely of tin, a precious and expensive metal at that time. So this was not some cheap product. This was luxury skincare, carefully crafted, expensively packaged. Was it medicinal, cosmetic, part of a religious ritual? We cannot know for certain. The fact that it was found in a temple precinct suggests it might have been an offering to the gods, perhaps a woman giving thanks for the remarkable properties of this cream. Or maybe it simply got lost during temple activities. Either way, that little tin of cream, with its 2,000-year-old finger marks, gives us a window into Roman beauty practices that written sources could never provide. Think about how many women used products just like this. How many carefully mixed their ingredients, tested different formulations, passed recipes from mother to daughter, from mistress to cosmetae to other mistresses. There was a whole economy of beauty knowledge, mostly invisible to us because it was women's knowledge, passed orally, practiced privately, rarely written down by the male authors who dominated Roman literature. But when these authors did write about skincare, they were often scornful. Pliny the Elder, despite documenting many cosmetic ingredients in his natural history, frequently added moral commentary. When he wrote about women washing their faces 700 times daily with donkey milk to efface wrinkles and preserve whiteness, you can hear the disapproval in his tone. 700 times. Was he exaggerating? Probably. But his exaggeration reveals real anxiety about women's beauty practices, about the time and money spent, about the prioritization of appearance. Yet women ignored the criticism and kept experimenting. They tried mint face masks, something we still use today for their cooling and refreshing properties. They used eggs, also still popular in modern skincare. They used olive oil, which any dermatologist today would approve of as an excellent moisturizer. They used almond oil, rich in vitamin E. They used frankincense, that precious resin from Arabia, which modern research has shown has anti-inflammatory properties. Not everything they tried was ridiculous. Some of their instincts were remarkably sophisticated, and the divide between rich and poor was stark here too. Wealthy women had access to imported ingredients, professional cosmetae, time to spend on elaborate skincare routines. Poor women made do with whatever they could find or afford. Wine dregs instead of imported rouge, soot from lamps instead of expensive antimony, cheap oils instead of frankincense. The pursuit of beauty crossed all classes, but the tools available were vastly different. Here is something that strikes me as both sad and fascinating. Despite all these treatments, despite the hours spent, the money invested, the exotic ingredients applied, Roman women still aged. Wrinkles still appeared, skin still damaged, youth still faded. The treatments could slow the process, could provide temporary improvements, could maintain appearance longer perhaps, but they could not stop time. And yet women kept trying, kept hoping, kept applying their potions and masks, generation after generation. Was it vanity? Or was it something more complex, something about maintaining control, maintaining power, maintaining relevance in a world that constantly told them their value was tied to their appearance? The answer is both, and neither, and everything in between. It was the reality they lived in, and they navigated it with the tools available to them, with creativity and persistence and hope, even when those tools included crocodile dung and burned snail ashes and dangerous toxic metals. But skin and face were only part of the story, because crowning all of this literally was hair, and Roman women's relationship with hair, the politics of hairstyles, the elaborate constructions atop their heads, the colours they achieved and the methods they used, that is where we need to go next. Because if you thought the face was complicated, wait until you see what happened above it, where fashion changed constantly, where imperial women set trends that everyone else scrambled to follow, and where the pursuit of the perfect coiffure could literally leave you bald. Imagine you are standing in the Forum, the beating heart of Rome, on a sunny afternoon in the year 120. Crowds surge around you. Senators in togas debate politics, merchants hawk their wares, children chase each other between columns, and then you notice something strange. You start paying attention to the women passing by, particularly the wealthy ones, the ones carried in litters or walking with entourages of slaves, and you realize that you can date their portraits almost precisely just by looking at their hair. That woman there, with the elaborate tower of curls piled high on her head, each ringlet carefully positioned, that is the style from 20 years ago, from the reign of Trajan. And that younger woman, her hair pulled back in waves with braids coiled around her head like a crown, that is the current fashion, popularized by the Empress Sabina. Hair in Rome was not just hair. It was a statement, a political declaration, a way of signalling loyalty and status and sophistication, all without saying a single word. The politics of Roman hairstyles were surprisingly intense. When a new emperor took power, when a new empress was crowned, her hairstyle became the fashion. Within months, wealthy women across the empire would be copying it. Portrait sculptors would be commissioned to update old statues, literally recarving the hair on marble portraits to match current trends. This is how we can date many Roman sculptures today. Archaeologists and art historians look at the hairstyle and say, this is from the Flavian period, this is from the Antonine era, based solely on how the hair is arranged. Think about that. Hair was so important, so tied to imperial power and social currency, that people literally chiseled away old hairstyles and carved new ones to stay current. Let me introduce you to some of the women who set these trends. Livia Drusilla, wife of Emperor Augustus, who lived from 58 before the Common Era to 29 of the Common Era. Livia was politically astute, powerful, and very aware of her image. Her portrait busts show her with a relatively simple hairstyle, at least by later standards. A centre part waves pulled back from the face, a small knot at the nape of the neck. This was the Augustan ideal, modest, controlled, traditionally Roman. But even this simplicity required effort. The waves were not natural. They were carefully set, probably heated with metal rods, held in place with pins and possibly light pomades. Then we have the Flavian women, late 1st century. The Flavian hairstyle was extraordinary. Imagine a wall of curls rising straight up from the forehead, sometimes 20 or 30 centimeters high, a vertical construction of ringlets that required hours to create and elaborate internal scaffolding to support. How did they achieve this? Metal frames hidden under the hair, padding made of wool or even other people's hair, countless pins holding everything in place. The effect was dramatic, impressive, and frankly, precarious. One wrong move, and the whole thing could collapse. Julia, daughter of Emperor Titus, popularized this style, and suddenly every wealthy woman in the empire wanted the Flavian tower. Slaves who specialized in hair, called ornatrices, the female version of ornatrix, were in desperate demand. The talented ones could command extraordinary prices, because creating these hairstyles was not just skill, it was art, it was architecture, it was engineering. But here is where it gets really interesting. Most Romans naturally had dark hair, brown, black, dark olive, the Mediterranean complexion and colouring that you would expect. But fashion, particularly during certain periods, demanded blonde hair, light, golden, exotic blonde. Why? Because it was different. Because it was associated with the barbarian tribes to the north, the Germans and the Britons, people Rome had conquered, whose exotic appearance fascinated Roman society. Blonde hair was foreign, unusual, striking, and therefore desirable. So Roman women dyed their hair, and the methods they used were elaborate, time-consuming, and frequently disastrous. Let me walk you through the most popular techniques. For blonde hair, the standard method involved a mixture of beech ash and goat fat. The beech trees would be burned, the ashes carefully collected and ground into a fine powder. This was then mixed with goat fat to create a paste. The paste was applied to the hair and left on for hours, sometimes overnight. The alkaline properties of the ash would lighten the hair, while the fat prevented complete dryness and damage. Did it work? Yes, actually. You could achieve a lighter colour, ranging from light brown to golden blonde depending on the starting colour and how long you left the mixture on. But there was a significant problem. The process was incredibly harsh on the hair. The alkaline ash damaged the hair shaft, made it brittle, prone to breaking. Women who dyed their hair repeatedly often found it becoming thinner, weaker, more fragile with each application. And if you were too aggressive, if you left the mixture on too long or used it too frequently, your hair could literally fall out. Baldness from over-dyeing was a real, recognized problem in Roman society. And when that happened, when wealthy Roman women found themselves losing their elaborately styled hair, they turned to wigs. And this is where the story gets fascinating, because the wig trade was a massive international industry. The finest wigs, the most sought after, were made from real human hair imported from Germania and Britannia. Blonde hair, red hair, the exotic colours that Romans could not naturally achieve. There was a thriving market centred around the Temple of Hercules in Rome, where hair merchants gathered. They sold full wigs for women who had lost all their hair, and smaller hair pieces, false braids and curls and switches that could be incorporated into existing hairstyles to add volume, length, or that coveted blonde colour without the damage of dyeing. Think about the supply chain this required. Hair had to be collected, probably from women in Germania and Britannia who cut or sold their hair, possibly willingly for money, possibly as part of the spoils of war, we cannot be certain. That hair had to be transported hundreds or thousands of kilometers to Rome. It had to be processed, cleaned, possibly dyed further, then fashioned into wigs and hairpieces by skilled craftspeople, and then sold at prices that only the wealthy could afford. It was globalization, ancient style driven by fashion and vanity. But what if you wanted red hair instead? Red was also fashionable, associated with exotic beauty, with passion. The method was simpler. Henna, the same plant used for skin decoration in many cultures, could be applied to hair to produce shades ranging from auburn to deep red. Henna is actually quite gentle on hair, unlike the harsh alkali treatments for blonde. It conditions as it colours, strengthens the hair shaft. So women who chose red were actually better off than their blonde-chasing sisters. The leaves of the henna plant would be dried, ground into powder, mixed with liquid, often just water or sometimes wine for deeper colour, applied to the hair and left to set. The results were generally good, and the hair remained healthy. For women who wanted to go darker to achieve a deep black that their natural brown could not quite reach, there were multiple methods. Antimony mixed with animal fat was one option. The same antimony used for eye makeup could be worked into a paste and applied to hair for darkening. Another method involved boiling cypress leaves with vinegar, then adding the ash of absinthe mixed with rose oil. This created a black dye that apparently worked well, though I suspect the smell was challenging. Cypress, vinegar, absinthe, rose oil, all mixed together and slathered on your head. The heavy use of perfume was looking more and more necessary with every beauty treatment we discuss. Now, before we move on, I need to tell you about one of the strangest fashion moments in Roman history. Emperor Commodus, who reigned from 180 to 192, was, to put it mildly, unusual. He believed he was the reincarnation of Hercules. He fought as a gladiator, which was absolutely scandalous for an emperor, and he dyed his hair blonde. Not just a subtle lightening, but bright, attention-grabbing blonde. He sometimes even dusted his hair with gold powder to make it shimmer. And suddenly, Roman men, who generally did not dye their hair because it was considered effeminate and improper, suddenly decided that maybe blonde was not so bad after all. Fashion-conscious aristocratic men started lightening their hair to match the emperor. The beech ash and goat fat preparations were suddenly in demand for male customers. Can you imagine? An entire gender flipping their grooming standards because one powerful eccentric man decided to be blonde. But this trend came with the same consequences. Men, unused to hair treatments, often over-applied the dye, and baldness among fashionable Roman men apparently increased noticeably during Commodus's reign, which meant that men too started purchasing wigs. The wig merchants near the Temple of Hercules must have been absolutely thriving. Let us talk about the tools and accessories involved in Roman hair care, because they were numerous and often luxurious. Hairpins were essential, obviously, for holding elaborate styles in place. The wealthy had pins made of ivory, carved with intricate designs. Pins of gold, sometimes set with small gemstones. Pins of silver, polished to a shine. These were not just functional, they were decorative, meant to be seen, to add sparkle and interest to the hairstyle. Archaeological excavations have found hundreds of these pins, suggesting just how many were used in a single elaborate hairstyle. A Flavian tower might require 50 or more pins to hold secure. Combs were equally important, both for styling and for maintenance. Ivory combs, again, for the wealthy. Bone combs for those less affluent. Wood combs for the poor. These were double-sided, often with wider teeth on one side for detangling, finer teeth on the other for smoothing and styling. Some combs were works of art, with handles carved into shapes, animals, mythological scenes. Your comb was another opportunity to display wealth and taste. And then there were the ribbons, the bands, the ornamental elements woven through hair or wrapped around the head. Silk ribbons for those who could afford it, linen for most. Sometimes gold or silver thread was woven into fabric specifically for hair decoration. The goal was always to add visual interest, to catch the light, to draw the eye upward to the crowning glory of the hairstyle. But maintaining all of this required professional help. The ornatrix, the slave woman who specialized in hair, was an absolutely crucial member of any wealthy household. She woke before her mistress, prepared her tools, heated the metal styling rods if curls were required, mixed dyes if colouring was scheduled, laid out pins and combs and accessories. Then came hours of work, washing the hair, drying it, applying treatment, styling, pinning, adjusting, perfecting. A truly skilled ornatrix was valuable beyond measure. She could make or break her mistress's appearance, and by extension her social standing. But this relationship was fraught with tension. Roman literature includes accounts of mistresses beating their ornatrices when hairstyles went wrong, when a pin was placed incorrectly, when a curl fell flat. The poet Ovid, in his Art of Love, actually warns mistresses not to torture their hairdressers, not to stab them with pins or slap them when frustrated. The fact that he has to give this warning tells us it was happening regularly. Imagine the stress for these enslaved women. Your entire day revolves around creating perfect hair. If you fail, you face physical punishment. If you succeed, well, that is just what is expected. There is no reward, only the absence of punishment. What about unwanted hair? Because Roman beauty standards demanded smooth, hairless bodies below the neck. Leg hair, underarm hair, any body hair visible on women was considered deeply unattractive, lower class, barbaric. So women removed it. How? The methods were numerous and almost universally painful. Plucking was common, using bronze or iron tweezers, going hair by hair. Can you imagine the time this took? The discomfort? But it was done, regularly, as part of grooming routines. More aggressive methods included pumice stones, rough, porous volcanic rock that could be rubbed against skin to abrade away hair. Effective? Yes. Comfortable? Absolutely not. This essentially sanded away hair, and probably a good bit of skin along with it. But smooth skin was the goal, and pain was apparently an acceptable price. Resin pastes were another option, an early form of waxing. Heated resin or pitch would be spread on the skin, allowed to cool slightly, then ripped off, pulling the hair with it. This is basically the same principle as modern waxing, though the materials were cruder and the process probably more traumatic. But wealthy women, or more accurately their enslaved attendants, did this regularly to maintain the smooth, hairless ideal that fashion demanded. You know what strikes me most about all of this? The sheer amount of time involved. We have talked about hours for makeup, hours for skincare, and now hours for hair. Add it all together, and wealthy Roman women were spending significant portions of their lives, cumulative weeks and months and years, on personal grooming. Was this their choice? In some sense, yes. They participated, they demanded skilled slaves, they purchased expensive products, they followed trends. But in another sense, no. Society demanded this of them. Their value, their status, their very identity as respectable Roman women of the elite class required perfect presentation. Hair was not optional. It was mandatory, and the fashions changed constantly. What was perfect one year was outdated the next. Keeping up required vigilance, resources, skilled help. It was exhausting. But opting out? That was not really possible, not if you wanted to maintain your social position. So women conformed, adapted, followed the trends set by empresses they might never meet, all to signal that yes, they belonged, they understood the rules, they could afford to play the game. But all of this grooming, all of this beautification, all of these hours of preparation, they were ultimately in service of appearing in public, of being seen, of displaying status. And nothing displayed status quite like jewellery. The weight of gold on your body, the flash of gemstones catching light, the careful accumulation of precious objects that you, unlike almost everything else in your life, actually owned, that is where we are heading next. Because Roman women's relationship with jewellery was unique, legally protected and absolutely fascinating. So let your mind drift from hairstyles and hair dye and painful hair removal, and prepare to enter a world of extraordinary wealth worn directly on the body, where a single piece could cost more than a villa, and where women collected treasures from across the known world. What is the most expensive thing you own? Take a moment and think about it. Your phone maybe, your car, your house, if you're lucky enough to own one. Now imagine owning something so valuable that you could sell it and buy all of those things combined, and imagine wearing it, on your body, every day, casually. That is what jewellery meant to wealthy Roman women. These were not just accessories, these were portable fortunes, walking displays of wealth that announced your status to everyone you passed. But here is what makes Roman women's jewellery truly special, truly different from almost any other possession in their lives. It was legally theirs, not their father's, not their husband's, theirs. To buy, to sell, to give away, to keep. In a world where women could not vote, could not hold office, could not even represent themselves in legal proceedings without a male guardian, jewellery was one of the very few things they could truly own and control, and that made it more than decoration. It made it power. Let me tell you a story. The year is 46 before the Common Era. Julius Caesar, the most powerful man in Rome, perhaps the most powerful man in the world at that moment, walks through a jewellery market. He is looking for something special, something extraordinary, a gift worthy of someone he values deeply, and he finds it. A single pearl, one pearl, large, lustrous, perfectly formed, imported from the distant shores of the Persian Gulf. The merchant names his price. 6 million sesterces. To put that in perspective, a Roman soldier at this time earned about 900 sesterces per year. This single pearl cost the equivalent of more than 6,600 years of a soldier's salary. In modern terms, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of dollars, possibly millions for one pearl. And Caesar bought it, without hesitation. He gave it to Servilia, the mother of Marcus Brutus. Yes, the same Brutus who would later participate in Caesar's assassination. Why such an extravagant gift? The rumours suggested she was his lover, though we cannot know for certain. But what we do know is that this pearl became famous throughout Rome, talked about, marvelled at, a symbol of ultimate luxury and Caesar's extraordinary wealth. But here is the thing. Servilia was not unique in owning spectacular jewellery. She was exceptional in having received a pearl that expensive, certainly. But wealthy Roman women routinely owned jewellery collections worth fortunes. The historian Pliny the Elder, writing in his Natural History, complained bitterly about the amount of money flowing out of Rome to pay for pearls and gemstones. He saw it as an economic crisis, wealth draining from the empire to benefit foreign traders. And he specifically blamed women. Women's obsession with jewellery, he argued, was bankrupting Rome. Was he right? Well, Partially. Rome did spend enormous sums importing luxury goods, but to blame women specifically was unfair. Men wore jewellery too, though less ostentatiously. The real issue was that Rome had become so wealthy through conquest and trade that the elite had money to spend on luxuries beyond anything previous generations could have imagined. And jewellery, portable, beautiful, durable, was an obvious target for that spending. Let us talk about pearls specifically, because they were the ultimate status symbol, the most desired gemstone in the Roman world. Pearls came primarily from the Persian Gulf, requiring long, dangerous journeys by sea and land to reach Roman markets. They were rare, difficult to harvest, beautiful, and therefore astronomically expensive. The finest pearls, the largest and most perfect, were reserved for the wealthiest women in the empire. And no one loved pearls quite like Emperor Caligula. This man, who ruled from 37 to 41 of the Common Era, and whose sanity is still debated by historians, was obsessed with luxury and excess. He had slippers decorated with pearls, slippers, shoes, covered in some of the most expensive gemstones in the world meant to be walked on. But that is not even the strangest part. According to ancient sources, Caligula had a pearl necklace made for his favourite horse. Yes, his horse. Incitatus was the horse's name, and Caligula apparently loved this animal so much that he planned to make it a consul, the highest political office in Rome, a pearl necklace for a horse. This is the level of absurd luxury we're talking about. Now, pearls were fashioned into various types of jewellery, but earrings were particularly popular. There was a specific style called crotalia, which translates roughly as rattles. These were earrings made from clusters of large pearl beads that would actually make noise when the wearer moved her head, a gentle rattling sound that drew attention. Can you imagine? Earrings designed not just to be seen but to be heard, announcing your presence with every movement, the sound of wealth literally tinkling in your ears. But pearls were just the beginning of the gemstone obsession. Emeralds were hugely popular, considered especially beautiful and valuable. The finest emeralds came from mines in the eastern desert of Upper Egypt, controlled by Rome, which gave Roman jewelers direct access to the source. These emeralds were usually left in their natural crystalline form, long hexagonal prisms, which were then drilled and strung on gold chains to make necklaces, bracelets, and earrings. The green was so vivid, so unlike anything else available, that emeralds became synonymous with luxury. Emperor Nero, remember him, husband of the pearl and donkey milk-loving Poppaea, was so obsessed with emeralds that he supposedly watched gladiatorial games through a large emerald, using it like a lens. Whether this improved his vision or was just an affectation of extreme wealth, we cannot say. But it gives you a sense of how precious these stones were, that an emperor would use one as a casual viewing device. Sapphires came from southern Asia, requiring even longer trade routes than emeralds. Deep blue, sometimes purple tinged, they were less common than emeralds but equally prized. Amethysts, with their purple colour, were popular because purple was the imperial colour, the colour of Tyrian dye, the most expensive dye in the world. Wearing purple amethyst was a way of aligning yourself with imperial prestige, even if you were not actually part of the imperial family. Garnets, those deep red stones, were imported from Egypt and were common enough that even moderately wealthy women could afford them. They were often set in gold or silver and used in rings, bracelets, and brooches. Topaz, diamonds in their uncut form, which were not yet facetted and therefore did not sparkle like modern diamonds. Moonstone, onyx, jasper, lapis lazuli from Afghanistan, bringing that incredible deep blue colour that had been prized since ancient Egyptian times. The variety was staggering, and then there was amber. The gold of the north, as it was called. Amber came from the Baltic Sea region, from what is now Poland, Lithuania, Latvia. It required a dedicated trade route stretching thousands of kilometres from the northern seas down through Germania and into Roman territory. The route was so important and so well established that it became known as the Amber Road. And the demand was insane. Pliny the Elder records that during the reign of Emperor Nero, a Roman knight, a member of the equestrian class, was sent on an expedition specifically to acquire amber. He returned with enough amber to decorate an entire gladiatorial stadium. An entire stadium. Imagine the quantity, the cost, the sheer logistics. But why was amber so desirable? It was beautiful, certainly, with its warm golden or honey colour. It was light, easy to wear, and the Romans believed it had protective and healing properties. Amber was thought to cure illness, to ward off evil, to bring good fortune. So it was not just decorative, it was almost medicinal, or at least believed to be. Mothers would give amber beads to their children to protect them. Wealthy women wore it not just for beauty but for the benefits they believed it provided. Now, let us talk about gold itself, because the purity standards in Rome were remarkably high. Roman gold jewellery almost never dropped below 18 carats, which is about 75% pure gold. This was not a legal requirement in most cases, but rather a matter of craft pride and consumer expectation. If you were selling gold jewellery in Rome, and it turned out to be less pure than claimed, your reputation was destroyed. So goldsmiths maintained high standards, and buyers could trust that what they purchased was genuine high-quality gold. The craftsmanship was extraordinary. Roman goldsmiths developed sophisticated techniques for working gold. Filigree, where thin wires of gold are twisted and arranged into delicate patterns, was hugely popular. Granulation, where tiny balls of gold are attached to create texture and design, was another favoured technique. These methods required incredible skill, steady hands, artistic vision. The results were jewellery pieces that were not just valuable for their gold content but were genuine works of art. What kinds of jewellery did Roman women actually wear? Well, if you were a wealthy woman getting dressed for an important social occasion, you would typically put on the following: rings, lots of rings, 2 on each finger of both hands except the middle fingers, which for some reason were left bare. That is 16 rings total. Can you imagine the weight? The flash of all that gold and those gemstones? Your hands would be literally glittering. Each ring might feature a different stone, a different design, creating a varied, complex display. Earrings were essential. Most Roman women had pierced ears and wore one set of earrings at a time, though they might own dozens of pairs to choose from. The most popular style was boat-shaped, fashioned from gold, often hollow to reduce weight, and decorated with pearls, gemstones, or intricate goldwork. These could be quite large, heavy, dangling past the jawline, impossible to miss. Necklaces came in many forms. A simple choker-style necklace sitting at the base of the throat was common, often made of gold links or beads. Some necklaces featured pendants, either a single large gemstone or an intricate gold design. Multi-strand necklaces with several chains worn together created visual impact and displayed even more wealth. And the most elaborate necklaces might feature combinations of different gemstones, gold, and even cameos, those carved stones depicting faces or scenes. Bracelets were worn on both wrists, sometimes several on each arm. Some were solid gold bangles designed as spiralling snakes, a very popular motif in Roman jewellery. The snake bracelets had no clasp. They simply slid onto the arm and stayed in place through their own spring, Others were hinged, secured with tiny gold pins or screws, and some were made of linked chains, flexible, lighter, but still impressive. Fibulae, those brooches used to fasten clothing, were another opportunity for display. Even though their function was practical, holding together the folds of a palla or stola, they were crafted from gold, set with gemstones, decorated with enamel work. You needed fibulae anyway to keep your clothes on, so why not make them as beautiful and expensive as possible? And here is something that respectable women did not wear, at least not publicly: anklets. Anklets were associated with prostitutes and dancers, women of questionable morality. If a respectable married woman wore anklets, she risked serious damage to her reputation. It is one of those strange fashion rules that seems arbitrary but was rigidly enforced by social pressure. You could wear 16 gold rings and massive pearl earrings, but ankle jewellery? Scandalous. Now, where did women acquire all this jewellery? Some was inherited, passed down from mothers to daughters, accumulating through generations. Some was given as gifts, from fathers to daughters, from husbands to wives, though interestingly, once given, the jewellery legally belonged to the woman, not the giver. She could do with it as she pleased. And some was purchased directly by the women themselves, which brings us to one of the most fascinating locations in ancient Rome, the Porticus Margaritaria. This was essentially a shopping arcade, a covered colonnade located on the Via Sacra, that most important street in Rome. The Porticus Margaritaria specialized in pearls and luxury jewelry. The name literally translates to pearl portico or pearl arcade. Here, specialized merchants called Margaritarii, pearl dealers, had their shops. They sold loose pearls, finished pearl jewelry, and other precious stones and gold pieces. This was the luxury shopping district, where the wealthiest women in Rome came to browse, to commission custom pieces, to see the latest imports from India or Egypt or the Persian Gulf. We know about the Margaritari because 18 inscriptions mentioning this profession have been found in Rome, most of them concentrated around the Via Sacra area. These inscriptions were tomb markers, dedications, guild records. They tell us that the pearl merchants organized themselves into professional associations, guilds that protected their interests, regulated trade, maintained standards. Being a Margaritarius was a prestigious, profitable profession. You were selling to the richest people in the empire. Your customers included empresses, senators' wives, the daughters of the most powerful families, and they had money to spend. But jewellery was not just about personal adornment. It served practical purposes too. Remember, in a world without banks as we know them, without safe deposit boxes or investment portfolios, jewellery was one of the few ways women could store wealth. If your husband died, if your family fell on hard times, if you needed money for any reason, you could sell jewellery. It was liquid wealth, portable, universally valued. A woman with a substantial jewellery collection had financial security that was rare for women in the ancient world. There are records of women using their jewellery to fund political causes, to bribe officials, to pay ransoms, to support family members. Jewellery was not just decoration, it was currency, it was power, it was autonomy. The fact that Roman law specifically protected women's right to own and dispose of their jewellery shows how important this was recognised to be. In a system that otherwise treated women as perpetual dependents, jewellery was the exception, the one area of clear, unambiguous ownership. And the social competition around jewellery was intense. You needed to keep up with your peers, to match their displays, to prove that your family was equally wealthy, equally connected, equally sophisticated. Underjewelling, appearing in public without adequate adornment, could be as damaging to your reputation as over-applying makeup or wearing an outdated hairstyle. It all formed part of the same complex system of social signaling, where appearance was constantly judged, constantly compared, constantly weaponized in the competition for status. Some critics, particularly male moralists, complained about women's jewelry obsession. They saw it as vanity, as wasteful, as evidence of moral decline. But they missed the point. Or perhaps they understood it perfectly, and that is why they were uncomfortable. Because jewelry gave women power, economic power through ownership, social power through display. And in a world that otherwise denied them so much that power mattered, as you settle deeper into comfort, feeling the weight of all that gold and all those gemstones in your imagination, let your mind shift to something even more extraordinary, even more expensive, something that literally caused economic crises and moral panic in Roman society. Because all the gold and all the gemstones, as spectacular as they were, could not compare to the single most luxurious material in the Roman world: silk. Silk from China, travelling 8,000 kilometres to reach Rome, costing more than most people earned in a lifetime, causing senators to pass laws banning its use, and yet worn anyway by women who refuse to give up beauty for politics. So let the sparkle of jewellery fade gently from your mind's eye, and prepare to be wrapped in the most controversial, most expensive, most desired fabric the ancient world had ever known. Picture yourself holding the most expensive piece of fabric you've ever touched. Maybe it is designer, maybe it cost you a few $100s, maybe even 1,000. Now multiply that cost by 10, by 50, by 100. Keep going until you reach a price so absurd that buying a single dress would require selling your house, your car, everything you own. That is what silk meant in Rome. Not expensive in the way we use the word casually today. Expensive in the way that made senators propose laws to ban it. Expensive in the way that historians blamed it for economic collapse. Expensive in the way that emperors tried to restrict who could wear it, and failed completely because the demand was simply too powerful to control. Silk arriving in Rome from China was not just fashion. It was a geopolitical crisis wrapped in beauty so extraordinary that people could not resist it no matter the cost. The year is 301 of the Common Era. Emperor Diocletian, trying desperately to control rampant inflation and economic chaos, issues the Edict on Maximum Prices. This massive document sets legal price limits on hundreds of goods and services across the empire, attempting to stabilize the economy through government control. In this edict, Diocletian lists the maximum legal price for 1 kilogram of raw silk. 4,000 gold coins. 4,000. To put that in perspective, the same edict lists a kilogram of pure purple dye, which we will discuss in a moment, at 150,000 denarii. A skilled labourer earned about 25 denarii per day. So 1 kilogram of silk cost the equivalent of roughly 160 days of skilled labour for 1 kilogram of raw material that you still has to weave and sew before you could actually wear it. How did silk even reach Rome? The journey is almost unbelievable. Silk production was a closely guarded secret in China, protected for centuries. The Romans had no idea how silk was made. They thought it grew on trees, that it was some kind of plant fibre. They did not know about silkworms, about the painstaking process of cultivating mulberry trees, feeding the worms, harvesting the cocoons, carefully unwinding the delicate threads. That knowledge was Chinese, and China intended to keep it that way because the monopoly made them extraordinarily wealthy. The silk reached Rome via the Silk Road, that famous network of trade routes stretching across Asia. Merchants in China would sell silk to intermediaries in Central Asia, who would transport it westward through Persia, through the Parthian Empire, through the hands of dozens of middlemen, each taking their profit, until finally it reached Roman territory, usually through eastern ports in Syria or Egypt. The distance was roughly 8,000 kilometers. The journey could take years, and every step added to the cost. By the time silk reached Roman markets, it was so expensive that only the absolute wealthiest could afford it, and yet they bought it, eagerly, desperately, despite the cost, despite the economic warnings, despite laws attempting to limit its use. Why? Because silk was unlike anything else in the Roman world. It was smooth beyond belief, so fine that it was almost transparent, light as air but with a luster and a drape that made the wearer look ethereal, otherworldly. Wearing silk was wearing fantasy, and for women whose lives were otherwise so controlled, so restricted, that fantasy had irresistible appeal. But silk created moral panic. Male Roman authors were absolutely beside themselves about silk. Seneca the Elder, the philosopher and rhetorician who lived from about 54 before the Common Era to 39 of the Common Era, wrote scathingly about women who wore silk. He said, and I am paraphrasing here because his Latin is rather colourful, that silk garments do not hide the body, do not even preserve decency. They cannot be called clothes at all because they reveal everything beneath them. He was horrified that women would wear something so sheer, so revealing. He called it immoral, immodest, a sign of declining virtue, and he was not alone. Multiple Roman authors complained that silk was essentially see-through, that it left nothing to the imagination, that women wearing silk might as well be naked. Of course, they were exaggerating, or at least we hope they were. But fine silk is indeed semi-transparent, especially in certain weaves and colours, and Roman women apparently either did not care about the transparency or actively enjoyed the scandal it created. The Senate actually passed legislation forbidding men from wearing silk. This happened during the early empire, the exact date is debated, but the law was explicit. Men could not wear silk garments because silk was considered effeminate, unmanly, inappropriate for Roman masculine virtue. Interestingly, there was no law forbidding women from wearing silk. Why? Probably because legislators knew such a law would be unenforceable. Women wanted silk, women bought silk, and trying to stop them would create more problems than it solved. But there was another issue beyond morality and fashion: economics. The trade imbalance was staggering. Rome was sending vast amounts of gold and silver to China and the intermediary merchants, and getting silk in return. But silk, unlike gold, could not be used as currency. It did not strengthen the empire, it just adorned wealthy people. Pliny the Elder calculated that Rome was losing 100 million sesterces per year to the silk trade. 100 million. In modern terms, we're talking about an enormous drain on Roman wealth, flowing eastward, enriching foreign powers, weakening Rome's economic position. Critics argued that this was unsustainable, dangerous, a threat to Roman power. They compared it to an addiction, women addicted to silk, unable to resist despite knowing the harm it caused. But the trade continued, because demand was simply too high, because wealthy Romans had money to spend and silk was what they wanted. The market was more powerful than the moralists. Now silk was not the only outrageously expensive fabric in Rome. There was something even more precious in a way, more symbolically important, more restricted by both cost and law. Purple. Not just any purple, but a specific shade called Tyrian purple, named after the Phoenician city of Tyre, where the dyeing technique was perfected thousands of years before Rome even existed. Tyrian purple was made from sea snails, specifically from the mucus secreted by murex snails found in the Mediterranean. And the process of making this dye was so labour-intensive, so resource-heavy, that Tyrian purple literally cost more than gold by weight. Here is how it worked. First, you had to harvest the snails. Thousands upon thousands of snails collected from the sea. Each snail produces only a tiny amount of the dye precursor, a few drops from a special gland. So to dye even a small amount of fabric required massive quantities of snails. The snails were crushed, the dye glands extracted, and then the material was fermented, exposed to sunlight, processed through several stages that took days or weeks. The smell was absolutely horrendous, so foul that dye works were typically located outside cities to avoid complaints. But the result, that deep, rich, purple colour with hints of red, was unlike anything else achievable through natural dyes. It was permanent, it did not fade in sunlight or washing, and it had a depth and luminosity that made it instantly recognisable. During the Roman Empire, purple became the imperial colour. Only the emperor could wear garments dyed entirely in Tyrian purple. For anyone else to do so was treasonous, punishable by death. The purple toga was the emperor's exclusive right, but, and this is important, women of the imperial family and wealthy aristocratic women could wear purple accents, purple trim, purple decorative elements. A stola with a purple border was the height of fashion and status. It announced that you were connected to imperial power, that you had wealth beyond imagining, that you understood the symbolic language of Roman society. The cost was staggering. Sources suggest that 1 kilogram of Tyrian purple dye could cost more than 10 kilograms of gold. More than gold. For dye. This meant that a garment dyed entirely in Tyrian purple, not that most people could legally wear such a thing, but if they could, it would be worth more than most homes. The purple-bordered garments that wealthy women did wear were investments, heirlooms, treasures guarded as carefully as jewellery. So when we imagine a wealthy Roman woman dressed for an important occasion, we need to see her in layers. First, the basic undergarments, simple linen, then the stola, the long tunic that marked her as a respectable married woman. The stola reached to her feet, had sleeves or was pinned at the shoulders, and was often made of fine wool or linen. For the wealthy, the stola might be made of silk or have silk elements. And crucially, it had the instita, the decorative border around the hem, often embroidered with gold thread or dyed with purple. Over the stola came the palla, the woman's version of the man's toga. The palla was a large rectangular shawl, wrapped around the body in elaborate folds, draped over one shoulder, pulled across to create cascading fabric that required skill to arrange properly. The palla was where wealthy women really displayed textile luxury. This is where you used your finest fabric, your brightest colours, your most expensive dyes. A palla of pure silk, dyed with Tyrian purple accents, would be the ultimate status symbol. Walking through Rome wearing such a garment would draw every eye, communicate wealth and power without a single word spoken. But not all purple was Tyrian purple. There were cheaper alternatives, other sources of purple and reddish dyes that could approximate the colour without the astronomical cost. Madder root produced reds and purples. Certain lichens and insects created similar shades. These were used by those who could not afford the real thing but wanted to participate in the fashion. The result was a spectrum of purples, from the deep, perfect Tyrian shade that announced imperial connections, to lighter, cheaper purples that showed aspiration but not achievement. Knowing the difference, being able to identify at a glance who was wearing real Tyrian purple and who was wearing an imitation, was part of social literacy in Rome. Colour in general was highly significant. Bright colours were expensive because dyes were expensive. Anything beyond natural wool beige or linen white required investment. So wearing vibrant colours, reds and blues and yellows and purples, announced that you could afford dyed fabric. The poor wore undyed garments, or at best, minimally dyed ones. The wealthy were a riot of colour, walking rainbows of textile investment. And here is something fascinating. Despite the laws, despite the economic arguments, despite the moral panic, women continued to demand luxury fabrics. They wanted silk despite its cost. They wanted purple despite its restrictions. They wanted the finest linens from Egypt, the most complex weaves, the most sophisticated embroidery. Why? For the same reason they endured hours of painful beauty treatments, the same reason they spent fortunes on jewellery. Because in a world that legally restricted them, appearance was power, the ability to command resources, to direct household spending toward their adornment, to appear in public dressed in ways that announce status and wealth. This was one of the few forms of agency available to them, and interestingly, textile production was one of the few professions considered virtuous for women. Spinning and weaving were praised as appropriate female activities. Even very wealthy women, who certainly did not need to make their own clothes, sometimes engaged in weaving as a demonstration of traditional virtue. Augustus's wife Livia famously produced homespun cloth for her household, spinning and weaving as her ancestors had done, even though she could afford the finest imported fabrics. This was a political statement, positioning herself as a model of old Roman virtue in contrast to the luxury and excess of her contemporaries. But most wealthy women were not Livia. Most did not spin or weave. They purchased fabrics from specialized artisans, commissioned garments from skilled tailors, employed enslaved workers to care for their extensive wardrobes. A wealthy woman's clothing collection could be vast, dozens or hundreds of garments for different occasions, different seasons, different social contexts. Storing and maintaining these garments required dedicated household staff, special storage rooms, careful attention to moths and mildew, and the various threats to fine textiles. And fashion changed. Not as rapidly as modern fashion, but it changed. Certain colours came in and out of favour. Sleeve styles evolved. The way the palla was draped shifted. The width of the stola hem varied. Keeping current required constant attention, frequent purchases, strategic decisions about when to adopt new trends and when to hold on to classic styles. It was exhausting and expensive, but opting out meant social irrelevance. The complete ensemble of a wealthy Roman woman, then, was a carefully constructed display. Jewellery announcing portable wealth and family connections, hair styled to match imperial fashion and demonstrate the work of skilled attendants. Makeup creating the porcelain perfection that society demanded, and clothing, layers of silk and purple and embroidered linen and gold thread, wrapping the body in visible proof of status, taste and power. Every element worked together to create an image, a presentation, a public self that bore the weight of family honour, social competition and personal identity. As you feel yourself drifting deeper into restfulness, imagine walking through that world wrapped in silk that cost more than gold, wearing purple that could get others executed for wearing it, draped in fabric that travelled 8,000 kilometres to reach you. The weight of it all, literal and metaphorical. The luxury, the expense, the restrictions, the freedoms. And now, let your mind shift from clothing to something even more indulgent, even more consuming. Because after hours of preparation, after adorning yourself in fortune's worth of jewels and fabric, where did you go? What did you do? You bathed. Oh, but not the way we bathe. Not a quick shower or a simple bath. You bathed Roman style, and that meant entering a world of ritual and relaxation and social connection that could consume your entire afternoon. So leave the wardrobe behind, and let us step together into the steam and heat and extraordinary luxury of Roman bathing culture. Step into steam so thick you can barely see your hand in front of your face. Feel heat wrapping around you like a blanket, so intense that sweat begins beading on your skin within seconds. Hear the echo of voices, laughter, conversations bouncing off marble walls and high-vaulted ceilings. Smell exotic oils, perfumes layered over the faint mineral scent of heated water. This is not a quick shower before work. This is not a 10-minute bath before bed. This is the Roman bathing experience, and it is about to consume your entire afternoon, possibly your entire evening, and it is glorious in ways that our modern, rushed, efficient bathing routines cannot begin to approach. Because Roman women did not bathe to get clean, though cleanliness was certainly achieved. They bathed to socialize, to relax, to see and be seen, to conduct business, to escape household demands, to experience pleasure in one of the few public spaces where women had genuine freedom of movement. Bathing was not hygiene, it was lifestyle. Let me take you through the process step by step so you can understand just how elaborate this ritual was. You are a wealthy Roman woman, it is early afternoon, perhaps the 8th hour by Roman timekeeping. You have finished your morning grooming, hours of makeup and hair styling. You have worn your jewellery and your silk and your purple-trimmed stola through the morning social obligations, perhaps receiving visitors at home, perhaps attending a religious ceremony, perhaps shopping in the markets, and now you are ready to bathe. If you are extraordinarily wealthy, you might have a private bathhouse attached to your villa. Most do not. Even the rich usually visited public baths, because bathing was social, and private bathing defeated much of the purpose. So you travel to the nearest bathhouse, possibly carried in a litter if you're very wealthy, or walking with an entourage of enslaved attendants. You arrive at a building that is, by any standard, architectural marvel. Roman bathhouses were some of the most sophisticated structures in the ancient world. Massive, elaborate, decorated with mosaics and sculptures and painted frescoes. The largest could accommodate thousands of bathers at once, and the engineering required to make them function was extraordinary. The key technology was the hypocaust system. Imagine this. Beneath the floors of the bathhouse is a raised floor, supported by pillars of brick or stone, creating a hollow space perhaps half a metre high. Furnaces, fired by wood or sometimes coal, heat air that flows through this space, warming the floor from below. In the hottest rooms, the heat also rises through hollow tiles in the walls, creating a completely heated environment. No open flames in the bathing rooms themselves, just radiant heat from below and around, maintaining consistent temperatures. It was genius. And it required constant tending, enslaved workers feeding the furnaces, monitoring temperatures, ensuring everything functioned properly. The bathhouse was divided into several main rooms, each serving a specific purpose in the bathing sequence. The standard progression was this. You started in the caldarium, the hot room, then moved to the tepidarium, the warm room, and finished in the frigidarium, the cold room. Hot, warm, cold. The Romans believed this sequence was essential for health, that the contrast in temperatures strengthened the body, improved circulation, prevented illness. Were they right? Well, modern research on contrast bathing, alternating hot and cold water, does suggest some health benefits, so maybe the Romans were onto something. You enter the changing room first, called the apoditerium. Here you remove your clothing, your jewellery, handing everything to attendants who will guard your possessions. You might wrap yourself in a light cloth, though many bathers went entirely naked, at least in some bathhouses and at some time periods. The question of nudity in Roman baths is actually complicated and fascinating. In early Republic times, men and women bathed separately, in different facilities or at different scheduled times. By the late Republic and early Empire, mixed bathing became common in many bathhouses, men and women together, often naked or minimally clothed, bathing, socializing, conducting normal social interactions. This scandalized some Romans, particularly conservative moralists, who saw mixed bathing as evidence of moral decay. They wrote scathing critiques, condemning the practice as immodest, inappropriate, leading to adultery and worse. But many Romans seem to have had no problem with it whatsoever. They bathed together casually, apparently without the sexual overtones that worried the critics. Though certainly, bathhouses also had reputations as places where sexual encounters happened, where prostitutes worked, where the line between legitimate relaxation and illicit pleasure blurred. The reality was probably that different bathhouses had different atmospheres, different clienteles, different standards of behavior. Christian writers, particularly after Christianity began spreading in the empire, were especially critical of mixed bathing. Clement of Alexandria, writing in the late 2nd century, railed against it, calling it shameless and sinful. But even Christian prohibitions did not entirely stop the practice. People love their baths too much to give them up easily, so you proceed, cloth-wrapped or not, into the caldarium. The heat hits you immediately. This room is hot, truly hot, temperatures that might reach 40 or even 45 degrees Celsius in some bathhouses. The air is thick with steam. Large basins of heated water line the walls, and there is usually a central pool also heated. You might immerse yourself completely, or you might sit on the heated floors and simply sweat. The point is to open your pores, to begin the cleansing process through heat and perspiration. Attendants move through the room offering services. They might pour water over you, help you into and out of pools, provide cloths for wiping sweat. And this is where one of the most distinctive Roman bathing tools comes in, the strigil. Have you ever seen a strigil? It is a curved metal blade, usually bronze, shaped something like a question mark, with a handle on one end and a curved scraping edge on the other. The purpose? To scrape oil and dead skin and sweat and dirt off your body. Here is how it worked. Before entering the caldarium, or sometimes while in it, you would be covered with oil. Olive oil usually, though wealthy bathers might use scented oils, expensive preparations imported from Egypt or Syria. The oil would be massaged into your skin, coating you thoroughly. Then, as you sat in the heat and sweated, the oil mixed with sweat and pulled dirt and dead skin cells away from your body. After sufficient time in the heat, an attendant would use the strigil to scrape all of this off. The curved blade would be run along your skin, removing the oil and everything it had collected. It sounds odd, possibly uncomfortable, but apparently it was effective and popular. The strigil became a symbol of bathing culture, frequently depicted in art, buried with wealthy Romans as grave goods, mentioned constantly in literature. After the caldarium, you moved to the tepidarium, the warm room. This was a transitional space, still heated but much less intensely than the caldarium. Here you might relax on benches, chat with friends, let your body adjust from extreme heat to more moderate temperature. The tepidarium was social space more than anything, a place to linger, to be seen, to participate in the communal aspects of bathing. And then the frigidarium, the cold room. This might contain an unheated pool or basins of cold water, sometimes even pools supplied with water from cold springs or aqueducts, genuinely frigid. After the heat of the caldarium, plunging into cold water was shocking, invigorating, supposedly incredibly healthful. Not everyone did this. Some Romans skipped the frigidarium entirely, preferring to end their bathing experience warm, but many embraced the cold plunge as an essential final step. The whole sequence could take hours, not because the bathing itself took that long, but because bathhouses were social spaces. They contained libraries you could read. They contained exercise yards. You could work out, play ball games, even watch athletic competitions. They contained rooms where food and drink were served. You could eat and drink. They contained spaces for massage, for additional beauty treatments, for hair removal, for all manner of personal care. Bathhouses were community centres, entertainment venues, health spas, and social clubs all combined into one. For women specifically, bathing offered something rare and precious, legitimate public space. Roman women were generally expected to stay home or to appear in public only with purpose and protection. But bathhouses were acceptable places for women to spend time, to socialise with other women, to relax without male supervision. This freedom was significant. Women could meet friends, conduct their own business negotiations, exchange information, form alliances, all under the socially acceptable guise of bathing. Some bathhouses catered specifically to women or had women-only hours or sections. Others were mixed. The largest bathhouses, the imperial thermae built by emperors as gifts to the people, were massive enough to accommodate everyone. The baths of Caracalla, completed around 216 of the Common Era, could hold 1,600 bathers at once. 1,600. The building covered 11 hectares. It had libraries, gardens, gymnasiums, shops. It was a city within a city. The cost to enter bathhouses varied. Some charged small fees, affordable to most free citizens. Others were more exclusive and expensive. Some days certain bathhouses might open for free, funded by wealthy patrons or politicians trying to gain popularity. Bathing was theoretically accessible to almost everyone in Roman society, though the quality of experience certainly varied by wealth. The rich brought their own attendants, their own oils and strigils, their own perfumed towels. The poor used what the bathhouse provided or went without, and the luxury attendants made all the difference. Wealthy women did not scrape themselves with strigils. They had enslaved workers do it. They did not pour their own water. They did not towel themselves dry. Every aspect of the bathing experience was handled by others, allowing the wealthy woman to simply relax, to be passive, to experience pleasure without effort. After bathing, there might be massage with scented oils, application of lotions or creams, hair grooming, even the reapplication of makeup if needed. The bathhouse experience blended seamlessly into the broader beauty and luxury rituals we've already discussed. Now, let me tell you about one woman who brought Egyptian bathing luxury to Rome and changed expectations forever. Cleopatra VII, Queen of Egypt, one of the most famous women in history, visited Rome in 46 before the Common Era. She came as the guest, some said the lover of Julius Caesar, and she brought with her Egyptian beauty practices that fascinated and scandalized Rome in equal measure. The smoky eye makeup which we mentioned earlier, elaborate perfumes, complex skincare routines, and most famously, milk baths. Egyptian royalty had long bathed in milk, believing it preserved youthful skin. Cleopatra supposedly preferred donkey milk or goat milk, warm, scented with honey and essential oils. When Romans saw this, when they heard about these exotic bathing practices, some were intrigued, others dismissive. but within a generation, wealthy Roman women were copying it. Poppaea Sabina, as we discussed, took it to extremes with her 500 donkeys, but the basic practice, adding milk to bathwater, became a recognized luxury treatment in Rome, directly traceable to Cleopatra's influence. Think about the logistics of heating all that water, by the way. The amount of fuel required, the labor involved. Bathhouses burned through enormous quantities of wood or coal. The environmental impact of Roman bathing culture must have been significant. Forests cleared to provide fuel for heating water for leisure. But Romans did not think in those terms. They thought about comfort, about health, about civilization. Bathing was what separated civilized Romans from barbarians. If you did not bathe regularly, you were not truly Roman. The time investment in bathing culture was substantial. A proper bath, with all the social aspects included, could easily consume 4 to 6 hours. Some wealthy Romans bathed daily, others every few days. But it was a significant, regular part of life. This was not a quick, functional shower. This was an event, an experience, a lifestyle choice that required dedication. And just as with every other aspect of luxury we've discussed, there were critics. Moralists complained that too much bathing made people soft, weak, overly focused on pleasure and comfort. They harked back to earlier, simpler times when Romans supposedly bathed less frequently and were therefore tougher, more virtuous. The reality is that Romans had always valued cleanliness and bathing, but the scale and luxury certainly increased dramatically as the empire grew wealthy. And with that increase came social anxiety about whether luxury was corrupting Roman character. But women, by and large, ignored the critics. They went to the baths. They spent their afternoons in steam and heat and cold water. They socialized. They relaxed. They escaped their homes and the constant demands of household management and child-rearing and social performance. The bathhouse was freedom, or at least a version of it. A few hours where they could exist in their own bodies, in pleasurable sensation, in female community, in a space that was genuinely theirs. As you let the imagined steam fade from your mind, as the echoes of conversation in marble halls grow quieter, as the sensation of water and heat and cold recedes into dreamy memory, turn your attention to something equally indulgent, equally consuming, and perhaps even more socially significant. Because after bathing, after being clean and relaxed and beautifully groomed once again, wealthy Roman women did not simply go home. They went to banquets, to elaborate, excessive, politically charged feasts that lasted for hours, where the food was exotic, the entertainment spectacular, and where women, for the first time in our journey tonight, reclined alongside men as equals in at least this one arena. So breathe deeply, let your body relax even more, and prepare to be invited to a Roman feast where luxury reaches heights that will surprise even after everything we've already explored together. The invitation arrives in the morning, a small wax tablet delivered by a well-dressed slave, the message scratched into the soft wax surface. You're invited to dine at the home of Senator Marcus Antonius Rufus this evening, beginning at the 9th hour. Please honor us with your presence. This is not a casual dinner invitation. This is a calculated political and social event disguised as a meal, and your attendance matters. Your husband will be there, obviously, conducting business, forming alliances, navigating the dangerous waters of Roman politics. But you will be there too, not sitting quietly in a corner as Greek women might have at their symposia. You will recline on a couch alongside your husband, visible, participating, acknowledged. This is one of the ways Roman women differed dramatically from their Greek counterparts. Roman women attended banquets. They were part of the social fabric of these events, and tonight's banquet will last somewhere between 8 and 10 hours, will involve food from 3 continents, entertainment that ranges from sublime poetry to crude spectacle, and enough wine to sink a small ship. Are you ready? Because Roman feasting was not about eating, it was about everything else. Let me set the scene properly. The sun is beginning its descent toward the horizon. You arrive at the senator's domus, his city home, dressed in your finest. The silk palla we discussed earlier, jewellery that catches the lamplight, hair elaborately styled, makeup perfect. You are announced, greeted by your host and hostess with carefully calibrated warmth, neither too effusive nor too distant. Social calculations are being made by everyone in real time. And then you are led into the triclinium, the dining room, and you see immediately that this is going to be an impressive evening. The triclinium is arranged in a specific configuration. 3 large couches, each capable of holding 3 diners, are arranged in a U-shape around a central open space. This creates seating for 9 guests total, which was considered the ideal number for a formal Roman dinner party. 9 people meant conversation could flow naturally. Everyone could hear everyone else. The group was intimate but substantial. More than 9 and the gathering became unwieldy. Fewer than 9 and it felt sparse, less prestigious. The couches themselves, called lecti, are not simple furniture. These are works of art. Wooden frames, often inlaid with ivory or bronze, cushions stuffed with the finest wool or even silk, coverings of expensive fabric. The wealthy competed to have the most impressive dining couches, the most comfortable, the most visually stunning. You will spend hours on this couch tonight, so its quality matters, and the arrangement of who reclines where is deeply political. The most honoured position is on the middle couch, at the right end. That is where the guest of higher status reclines. Other positions reflect descending levels of honour and status. You and your husband are assigned your couch and position based on your social standing relative to the other guests. Everyone understands this immediately. No words need to be spoken. Now here is something that distinguishes Roman banquets from Greek ones. You, a respectable married woman, are going to recline. The Greeks did not allow this. Greek women, if they attended male drinking parties at all, sat. Reclining was a male privilege, a symbol of leisure and power. But Roman custom evolved differently. By the late Republic, and certainly during the Empire, respectable married women reclined at banquets alongside men. They ate the same food, drank the same wine, participated in the same conversations. This was radical, at least by Greek standards, and it was one of the small ways Roman women had more social freedom than their Greek counterparts. You settle onto your couch, arranging your palla gracefully. Enslaved attendants immediately materialize, offering to wash your hands, providing cushions for your comfort, asking if you need anything. The room itself is spectacular. The walls are covered in frescoes, elaborate painted scenes of mythological subjects, gardens, architectural fantasies. The floor is mosaic, so detailed that you can make out individual feathers on painted birds, individual scales on swimming fish. Oil lamps flicker on stands and in niches, creating soft, warm light. Everything is calculated to impress, to demonstrate wealth and taste and cultural sophistication. And then the food begins to arrive. Roman banquets followed a specific structure. The gustatio, the appetizer course, came first. This might include eggs, shellfish, vegetables marinated in vinegar, small savoury pastries, nothing too heavy. The purpose was to stimulate appetite to begin the evening gently. With the gustatio came mulsum, honeyed wine, sweet and easy to drink. The Romans never drank wine undiluted. They always mixed it with water, and often with honey or spices as well. Drinking wine straight was considered barbaric, something only uncivilized foreigners would do. After the gustatio came the mensa prima, the main course or courses, plural, because there could be many. And this is where Roman excess truly showed itself. What might you eat at a wealthy senator's banquet in the height of the empire? Let me give you examples from actual historical accounts. Oysters from Britain, transported in barrels of seawater, still alive when they arrived in Rome. These were expensive delicacies, prized for their supposed aphrodisiac properties. Wild game, venison, wild boar, hare, sometimes even more exotic animals. Peacock prepared and served with its elaborate tail feathers reattached for visual display. Flamingo tongues. Yes, actual tongues cut from flamingos and prepared as a delicacy. Scandalously expensive and rare. The Roman cookbook attributed to Apicius, likely compiled in the late 4th or early 5th century but containing recipes from earlier periods, gives us insight into the complexity of Roman cooking. Dishes were heavily spiced with pepper, cumin, coriander, ingredients imported from India and the East at great cost. Sauces were elaborate, often featuring garum, that fermented fish sauce that was ubiquitous in Roman cooking. The flavors were bold, complex, nothing like the simple peasant food that most Romans ate daily. This was haute cuisine, designed to impress, to showcase the host's ability to acquire rare ingredients and employ skilled cooks. Between courses there were breaks. This is when entertainment happened. Musicians playing lyres, flutes, water organs, singers performing popular songs or newly composed pieces, poets reciting their latest works, perhaps even the Aeneid, Virgil's epic that had become the cultural touchstone of educated Romans. If you were lucky, the poetry was good. If you were unlucky, you suffered through amateur verse for hours, but you applauded politely either way, because social grace demanded it. Sometimes the entertainment was more active. Acrobats tumbling through the triclinium, their bodies contorting in impossible ways. Dancers, often young women, performing with veils or props. These dancers occupied an uncomfortable social position. Their performances were entertaining, even beautiful, but they were also seen as somewhat disreputable, their bodies on display in ways that respectable women's were not. Yet wealthy families hired them regularly, another of those Roman contradictions where moral disapproval and actual practice existed side by side. And occasionally, the entertainment was outright bizarre. Trained animals performing tricks, dwarfs and disabled people displayed for guests' amusement, a practice that is deeply uncomfortable to modern sensibilities, but was apparently common in Rome. The cruelty embedded in this entertainment, the exploitation of the vulnerable for wealthy people's pleasure, is one of those aspects of Roman culture that we cannot romanticize away. It was part of the darkness underlying the luxury. The wine flowed continuously. Slaves moved through the triclinium with jugs, constantly refilling cups. The mixing was done to each guest's preference. Some liked their wine mixed 3 parts water to 1 part wine, very diluted. Others preferred equal parts. The truly hardcore might go 2 parts wine to 1 part water, but more than that was considered excessive, dangerous even. The goal was to maintain a pleasant level of intoxication throughout the evening, enough to loosen conversation and inhibitions, not so much that you completely lost control, though certainly some diners failed at this balance regularly. The Romans had special devices for heating water to mix with wine. Called orthepsae, these were essentially early samovars, metal containers with internal chambers for hot coals, keeping water at the perfect temperature. Slaves would bring these to the couches, mixing hot water with wine directly in each guest's cup. The technology was sophisticated, the attention to detail remarkable. Everything about the banquet was designed to create perfect comfort, perfect pleasure. After the main courses came the mensa secunda, the dessert course. Fruits, nuts, sweet pastries drizzled with honey, small cakes. By this point in the evening, you had been eating for hours. Your stomach was full. Which brings us to one of the most notorious aspects of Roman banqueting, the aspect that shocks modern people more than almost anything else, the vomiting. Yes. Romans at lengthy banquets sometimes induced vomiting to make room for more food. There are multiple historical references to this practice. Seneca the Younger wrote disapprovingly about people who vomit to eat and eat to vomit. Suetonius records that Emperor Claudius considered issuing an edict encouraging flatulence at the table, believing that holding in gas could be dangerous to health. The idea that bodily functions should be managed for health and comfort rather than suppressed for politeness was apparently widespread. Now the extent of the vomiting practice is debated by historians. The myth of the vomitorium as a room specifically for vomiting is false. Vomitoria were actually passageways in amphitheatres where crowds exited, the name coming from how crowds spewed forth from these exits. But the practice of occasional vomiting during very long, very excessive banquets, that appears to be real. Diners would leave the triclinium, go to a private area, use a feather to tickle the back of the throat, induce vomiting, and return to continue eating. Is this shocking? Disgusting? Absolutely by modern Western standards, but remember the context. These banquets lasted 8, 10, sometimes 12 hours. The sheer quantity of food was overwhelming, and in a culture where displaying wealth through elaborate feasting was a social requirement, where hosts competed to provide more courses, rarer ingredients, more spectacular presentations, guests needed strategies to keep up. Vomiting was a practical solution to a social problem created by extreme excess. And here is something else that happened at banquets, something whispered about but rarely recorded explicitly in respectable sources. Affairs began. Sexual connections were made. The combination of dim lighting, reclining positions, flowing wine, hours of intimate conversation, it created opportunities. The physical closeness of diners on shared couches, the relaxed atmosphere, the partial darkness, all of this made banquet spaces where social and sexual boundaries could blur. Respectable women had to navigate this carefully. Too aloof and you were boring, unsociable. Too friendly and your reputation suffered. The balance required constant attention. The political dimensions of banquets were enormous. Alliances were forged over food and wine. Political positions were discussed, debated, sometimes changed. Patronage relationships were established and maintained. The senator hosting tonight's banquet has political ambitions. Every guest present was chosen carefully. You're here because your husband's support matters, but you matter too. Your conversation with the senator's wife, your interactions with other female guests, your behavior and presentation, all of this reflects on your family's reputation and political standing. Some hosts competed through sheer extravagance. The most famous example is probably the teenage emperor Elagabalus, who reigned from 218 to 222 of the Common Era. Historical accounts, which may be exaggerated but are nonetheless revealing, claim that his banquets featured camel feet, the brains of 600 ostriches served in a single dish, conger eels fattened on the flesh of executed slaves, and caviar from fish caught by his private fishing fleet. He supposedly arrived at banquets on a chariot pulled by naked women. The excess was so extreme that it became legendary, symbolic of imperial decadence and dysfunction. But Elagabalus was extreme even by Roman standards. Most banquets, even wealthy ones, were not quite that outrageous. They were still excessive by our standards, certainly. A typical elite banquet might feature a dozen different dishes, wines from multiple regions, entertainment from several performers. But the goal was refined luxury, not circus-level spectacle. As the evening progresses, as you have eaten and drunk and conversed for hours, as the oil lamps burn lower and the conversation becomes more relaxed and perhaps more honest, you might feel a strange mix of emotions. Pleasure, certainly. The food is extraordinary, the wine pleasant, the company sophisticated, but also perhaps weariness. These events are performances, and you've been performing all evening, smiling appropriately, laughing at jokes, engaging in careful political conversation, monitoring your behavior constantly. It is exhausting. Finally, deep into the night, the banquet begins to wind down. Some guests have already left, making their excuses, being carried home in litters by their attendants. Others linger, enjoying a final cup of wine, a final conversation. You and your husband prepare to depart. Farewells are made, thanks expressed. You have navigated successfully. Your reputation is intact, perhaps even enhanced. Alliances have been strengthened. Social obligations have been fulfilled. And tomorrow, or rather today, since it is now well past midnight, the entire cycle will begin again. More grooming, more preparation, more social performance, more luxury and restriction intertwined in that uniquely Roman way. As you drift deeper into the softness of sleep, imagine leaving that banquet, being carried through dark Roman streets in a litter, the taste of honeyed wine still on your lips, exhausted but satisfied. Behind you lies hours of carefully calibrated social interaction. Ahead lies home, rest, and then the cycle beginning again. But home is not just a place to sleep. Home for wealthy Roman women was its own kind of luxury, its own demonstration of power and taste, and that is where we are heading next. Into the private spaces, the villas and domus where Roman women lived, where they ruled their domestic kingdoms with enslaved attendants at their command, where marble and mosaic and fountain and garden created environments of extraordinary beauty. So let the banquet fade into memory, let the noise and light dim, and prepare to enter the domestic world of Roman luxury, where power and beauty existed behind closed doors. Walk through the front door of your home and tell me what you see. Furniture, maybe a television, normal everyday things that serve practical purposes, comfortable, functional, but probably not designed to make visitors gasp in awe. Now erase all of that from your mind, because when a wealthy Roman woman returned home from that long banquet we just attended, when she stepped through the entrance of her domus or villa, she entered a space so visually stunning, so carefully designed to impress, that every surface, every object, every sight line had been calculated for maximum impact. Home was not just where you lived. It was a three-dimensional advertisement for your family's wealth, taste, power, and cultural sophistication. It was art you walked through. It was architecture that told stories. It was luxury made permanent in stone and marble and paint and gold. And for the Roman woman, it was her domain, the space she managed and controlled even if she did not legally own it. Her kingdom of beauty and order maintained by dozens of enslaved hands. Let us enter together slowly so you can understand the experience. You approach the house from the street. The exterior is actually quite plain, deliberately so. Roman houses turned inward, presenting blank walls to the public, protecting privacy and security. But the door might give a hint. Heavy wood, possibly imported cedar or oak, bronze fittings, maybe decorative knockers shaped like lion heads or gods. This is your first signal that something impressive lies beyond. You pass through the vestibulum, the entrance hall, usually small and functional, and then suddenly you step into the atrium and everything changes. The atrium is the heart of the Roman house, and it is designed to overwhelm. It is a large rectangular room open to the sky through a central opening called the compluvium. Sunlight pours through this opening, illuminating everything below. Directly beneath the compluvium is a shallow pool, the impluvium, catching rainwater that drains into cisterns below for household use. But the impluvium is not just practical, it is decorative. The pool might be lined with marble, might contain floating flowers, might reflect the sky and clouds in its still water, creating a mirror effect that makes the space feel larger, lighter, more magical. Around the atrium, the walls. And here is where you first encounter what made Roman domestic spaces truly spectacular: frescoes. Painted directly onto the plastered walls, these frescoes depicted everything. Mythological scenes showing gods and heroes, landscapes of imaginary gardens or seascapes, architectural fantasies, painted columns and archways that fooled the eye into thinking the room extended further than it actually did. The skill required to create these frescoes was extraordinary. Artists worked quickly on wet plaster, painting before it dried, a technique called buon fresco that created permanent, vibrant colours. The best artists commanded high fees. Their work transformed walls into windows onto other worlds. The colour palette was sophisticated. Egyptian blue, created from copper and calcium compounds, provided brilliant blue tones. Cinnabar, despite being toxic mercury sulfide, gave deep reds. Yellow ochre from iron oxides, green from malachite, and for the wealthiest, backgrounds painted with actual gold leaf. Standing in an atrium surrounded by these frescoes, you are not just in a room. You are inside art, surrounded by beauty, by myth, by the owner's expensive taste, and beneath your feet, mosaics. Roman floor mosaics were technical marvels. Tiny pieces of coloured stone and glass, called tesserae, each perhaps half a centimetre square, were set into mortar to create images. The finest mosaics used hundreds of thousands of these tiny pieces, creating pictures so detailed they looked almost photographic. Geometric patterns were common, creating visual complexity through repetition and colour variation. But the real showpieces were the figured mosaics, the ones depicting scenes. Here is one of my favourite examples, a type of mosaic that appeared in multiple wealthy Roman homes, but that still makes me smile when I think about it. The unswept floor mosaic. These mosaics depicted the aftermath of a banquet. Fish bones, shells, fruit peels, olive pits, vegetable scraps, all scattered across the floor in meticulous detail, each tiny piece of garbage rendered perfectly. Why? Because Romans had a sense of humour. They created trompe-l'œil effects, visual tricks that fooled the eye. After an actual banquet, when real food scraps littered the floor as guests had tossed them down during the meal, the fake garbage on the mosaic would blend in, camouflaging the real mess. Guests would step carefully around mosaic fish bones that were not actually there. It was playful, clever, and expensive. Only wealthy families could afford to commission such elaborate jokes. But the atrium was just the beginning. From the atrium, you might move into the tablinum, a room that served as an office or reception space, usually positioned to allow sight lines all the way through the house. The tablinum was where the male head of household, the paterfamilias, conducted business, received clients, managed affairs. But the woman of the house had authority here too. She supervised the household accounts, managed the staff, made decisions about supplies and maintenance. Her power was domestic, but do not underestimate its significance. A large Roman household might employ 50 or 100 enslaved workers. Managing that many people, ensuring the smooth functioning of a complex operation, required intelligence, organizational skill, and authority. Beyond the tablinum lay the peristyle, and this is where wealthy Roman homes became truly exceptional. The peristyle was a colonnaded garden courtyard, a private outdoor space surrounded by covered walkways. Columns, dozens of them in the largest houses, made of marble or sometimes just plastered brick painted to look like marble. The columns supported roofs that created shaded walking areas around the garden, and the garden itself, the garden was paradise contained. Roman elite were obsessed with gardens. They imported exotic plants from across the empire, roses from the east, prized for their scent and used extensively in perfumes and cooking, fruit trees, fig, apple, pear, cherry, nut trees, cypress and pine for their elegant shapes, flowering shrubs, herbs for cooking and medicine, and water features, always water features. Fountains splashing gently, the sound of water creating a peaceful atmosphere. Small streams or channels, fed by the same aqueduct system that supplied the baths, running through the garden. Statues positioned throughout, usually marble copies of famous Greek originals, depicting gods, athletes, mythological scenes. The wealthiest families created elaborate garden designs, with geometric patterns formed by low hedges, with seating areas positioned to take advantage of shade or sun depending on the season, with mosaic paths winding through the plantings. The garden was a retreat, a place to read, to think, to escape the demands of social life while still remaining within your own home. For women especially, who were expected to spend most of their time at home, these gardens provided relief from the confinement of indoor spaces. Around the peristyle were the private rooms of the house, cubicular bedrooms, smaller and more intimate than the public spaces. Even here, though, luxury prevailed. Beds were not just places to sleep. They were furniture pieces constructed from fine woods, inlaid with ivory or bronze, decorated with carved details. The mattresses were stuffed with wool or, for the wealthiest, down. Multiple layers of fabric created softness. Pillows filled with feathers, coverlets woven or embroidered with elaborate patterns. And remember, in winter, the acus system we discussed earlier heated these rooms from below, warming the floors, making the entire space comfortable even when outside temperatures dropped. Some houses had private libraries, rooms lined with niches holding scrolls, hundreds or thousands of texts, literature, philosophy, history, poetry, technical manuals. The Romans did not have bound books as we know them. Instead, they had scrolls, long sheets of papyrus or parchment rolled around wooden rods. Reading a scroll required unrolling it as you progressed through the text, a physical process quite different from flipping pages. But for educated Romans, and yes, some wealthy women were quite educated despite all the restrictions on their formal schooling, libraries were treasures. The ability to own and read texts from across the Mediterranean world was another form of luxury, intellectual rather than physical but equally valued. Private chapels or shrines appeared in many homes, spaces dedicated to household gods, the lyres and penates who protected the family. These shrines might be simple niches with small statues and offerings, or elaborate rooms with painted walls and expensive votives. Religion permeated Roman life, and domestic religion was the woman's responsibility. She maintained the household shrine, made offerings, ensured that the family remained in good standing with the protective deities. This gave her spiritual authority, a role that was hers and hers alone. Now, I need to be honest about something. Everything I have described, all of this luxury and beauty, was available only to a tiny fraction of the Roman population. The wealthy elite, perhaps 5 or 10% of Rome's population, lived in domus like these. But the vast majority, including many free citizens with jobs and incomes, lived in insulae. These were multi-story apartment buildings, the ancient equivalent of tenement housing. Insulae were crowded, often poorly constructed, prone to collapse and fire. They had no running water above the ground floor, no private toilets, no heating beyond small charcoal braziers that were themselves fire hazards. Residents of insulae emptied their chamber pots into the street or into public latrines. They fetched water from public fountains. They cooked on small portable stoves or bought prepared food from street vendors because they had no kitchens. The contrast between a marble villa with its gardens and fountains and hypocaust heating and a cramped fourth-floor insular apartment with no water and no heat was stark. And this contrast shaped Roman society. Luxury for the few was built on the labour and deprivation of the many. Every beautiful mosaic, every painted fresco, every meal prepared, every garden maintained, required work. And that work was done overwhelmingly by enslaved people who would never live in spaces like these, who might not even have private sleeping quarters, who were property supporting the lifestyle of their owners. For wealthy women living in these villas, their relationship with the enslaved staff was complex. These were the people they saw every day, who knew their routines intimately, who handled their clothes and jewellery and food, who heard their private conversations, who raised their children. Some mistresses treated their slaves with cruelty, the beatings we mentioned earlier when hairstyles went wrong. Others developed something like genuine affection for certain slaves, particularly long-serving household members or the nurses who raised their children. But even kindness could not erase the fundamental relationship. One person owned the other. One could be sold at will. One had rights, the other had none. The villa itself, for the wealthiest families who owned country estates as well as city homes, could be even more impressive than the urban domus. Country villas sprawled across the landscape. They included not just residential spaces but agricultural operations. Olive groves producing oil, one of Rome's most important trade commodities. Vineyards producing wine, grain fields, livestock. These estates were economic engines, generating wealth through agriculture, managed by overseers but owned by the Roman elite. The villa became a self-sustaining unit, producing food and goods for its residents and for sale in markets. The Villa of the Mysteries outside Pompeii, preserved by the volcanic eruption of Mount Vesuvius in 79 of the Common Era, gives us extraordinary insight into luxury villa life. The walls contain some of the finest surviving Roman frescoes, depicting mysterious religious rituals with life-sized figures. These frescoes are so vivid, so detailed, so beautifully executed that they remain stunning nearly 2,000 years later. And this was a relatively modest villa. The truly grand country estates of the super-wealthy were even more elaborate. Living in these spaces, walking through marble halls and colonnaded gardens, dining in rooms where every surface was art, wealthy Roman women inhabited beauty constantly. Their entire environment was designed for aesthetic pleasure, but it was also designed for display. Homes were semi-public spaces in Rome. Visitors came constantly for business, for social calls, for political meetings. the beauty of your home reflected directly on your family's status. A poorly decorated home, plain walls, simple mosaics, these signalled either poverty or lack of taste, both equally damaging to reputation. So maintaining the home, keeping it beautiful, updating decorations when styles changed, adding new statues or fountains or furniture, this was an ongoing process requiring constant attention and investment. For the mistress of the house, managing all of this was a significant responsibility. She might not legally own the property, but she controlled its day-to-day operations. Her aesthetic decisions shaped what visitors saw and judged. As you settle even deeper into comfort, as sleep pulls at the edges of your consciousness, let these images drift through your mind. Sunlight through the compluvium, reflecting in the impluvium. Painted walls telling stories of gods and heroes. Mosaic floors so detailed you could count individual fish scales. Gardens filled with roses and fountains. This was home for wealthy Roman women. A gilded cage, perhaps, but gilded indeed. And yet, for all the beauty surrounding them, for all the luxury at their disposal, none of it would have been possible without the people who made it happen. The invisible hands that created and maintained every aspect of this life. The enslaved workers whose labour supported the entire system. And that is where we turn our attention next, to the shadow side of Roman luxury, to the people whose stories are harder to find, but who were essential to everything we've explored together tonight. Behind every hour of luxury stood uncounted hours of labour. Behind every perfect hairstyle stood a woman whose hands ached from holding pins and hot irons. Behind every elaborate meal stood kitchen workers who tasted nothing but leftovers. Behind every spotless marble floor stood someone scrubbing on their knees in the pre-dawn darkness. We have talked about the cosmeti, those skilled beauty slaves, but they were just a small fraction of the human machinery required to maintain elite Roman life. A wealthy household might employ 50 enslaved workers. Some had 100 or more. These were not servants who could quit and find other employment. These were people who were property, owned as completely as the furniture, subject to their owner's absolute power. And the luxury we have been exploring together all night, every beautiful, extravagant, spectacular element of it, depended entirely on their labour. This is the part of the story that makes us uncomfortable. That should make us uncomfortable, because understanding Roman women's luxury without understanding the human cost is understanding only half the truth. Let me introduce you to people whose names we will never know. Start with the woman who woke at dawn to light the fires in the hypocaust furnace, feeding wood into the flames, maintaining the heat that kept the house warm, that heated the bath water, that made winter bearable for her owners, while she herself worked in the cold and smoke. She might have been responsible for this task every single day, year after year, her lungs gradually damaged by smoke inhalation, her hands calloused and burned from handling wood and hot metal. Did she have dreams? Did she remember freedom if she was born free and then enslaved through war or debt? Did she have children who were also enslaved, property of the same household or sold away? We do not know. Her story was not written down. But she was real as the wealthy women whose beauty routines we have discussed in such detail. Consider the litter carriers, the men who physically transported wealthy women through Rome's streets. A standard litter required 4 to 6 bearers, strong men who carried the weight of the litter frame, the cushions and decorations, and the passenger herself, sometimes for miles. This was exhausting work, physically demanding, requiring coordination between the bearers to keep the litter stable and smooth. The wealthy woman inside reclined in comfort, perhaps reading, perhaps dozing, certainly not thinking much about the men whose shoulders and backs made her transportation possible. These bearers were expensive, well-trained slaves. They were valuable property, so they were probably fed adequately and given basic medical care when injured, but only in the same way you would care for an expensive horse. Their well-being mattered because they were useful, not because they were human beings with inherent dignity. The kitchen staff of a wealthy Roman household worked in conditions we would find appalling. Kitchens were hot, smoky, dangerous spaces. Cooking was done over open fires. Burns were common. The work began before dawn, preparing the morning meals, and continued late into the night after banquets, cleaning up, putting away food, preparing for the next day. The head cook, if skilled, might have some status within the household hierarchy. Talented cooks were prized, could command relatively better treatment. But the junior kitchen staff, the people who did the actual work of chopping and stirring and cleaning, they were invisible, nameless, worked until exhaustion. And here is something that reveals the absolute power owners held over enslaved people. At that banquet we attended earlier, remember the singing cooks mentioned in historical sources, enslaved kitchen workers who were required to perform, to sing while they served food, to provide entertainment along with sustenance. Can you imagine the psychological toll? You are property. You work all day in unbearable heat preparing food you will not eat, and then you must smile and sing for the amusement of people who own you, who could beat you or sell you or kill you with essentially no legal consequences. The cruelty is almost incomprehensible. Childcare was another major area of enslaved labour in wealthy households. Wet nurses, women who breastfed the infants of elite women who chose not to nurse or could not, were common. These enslaved women had often given birth themselves, but their own children were taken away so they could nurse the children of their owners. Think about that separation, that forced prioritization of someone else's child over your own. Some wet nurses developed genuine bonds with the children they raised. We have tombstone inscriptions where adult Romans memorialized their childhood nurses with affection, even sometimes freeing them in wills. But that affection could not erase the fundamental injustice. The nurse had no choice about caring for the child. Her own children, if she had them, were enslaved alongside her, or sold away, or raised by other enslaved women in the same household. Pedagogues, enslaved men who served as tutors and guardians for elite boys, accompanied their young charges everywhere, carried their books and writing materials, supervised their education and behaviour. Some pedagogues were educated themselves, prisoners of war from Greece or other cultured regions, their learning making them valuable as teachers. Others were simply trusted household slaves assigned to watch over children. Either way, they had no freedom, no ability to say no, no power to leave even if they were mistreated by the children they supervised. The household manager, called a villicus in rural estates, or sometimes just a senior trusted slave in urban homes, occupied a strange position. They had authority over other slaves, managed day-to-day operations, made decisions about supplies and schedules. In some ways they wielded significant power, but they were still enslaved. Their authority existed only at the pleasure of the owner and could be revoked instantly, and managing other slaves meant sometimes having to enforce punishments, to be the instrument of the owner's control over people who were, ultimately, in the same powerless position. Skilled artisans within households, people who could do carpentry, metalwork, textile production, these workers created value for their owners. A wealthy household might have enslaved weavers producing cloth, not just for household use but for sale, generating income that went entirely to the owner. The weaver received nothing beyond basic sustenance. Their skill, their labour, their time, all belonged to someone else. Some skilled slaves could eventually buy their freedom, saving money from occasional tips or small-paid jobs they were allowed to take on the side. But this was difficult, took years or decades, and was only possible if the owner permitted it. The reality of Roman slavery varied enormously. Some slaves were treated with relative decency, given adequate food and shelter, allowed to form families, eventually freed in their owner's will. Others were brutalized, worked to death, disposed of when no longer useful. The legal framework allowed almost unlimited power to owners. There were very few protections for enslaved people. If an owner killed a slave, the legal consequences were minimal, essentially property damage. If a slave killed or seriously injured their owner, not only was that slave executed, but potentially all the slaves in the household could be executed as well. Collective punishment designed to enforce absolute obedience through terror. This is difficult to hear, I know. It is difficult to say. But we cannot talk honestly about Roman luxury without confronting this. The perfume that masked the smell of lead makeup, the silk that cost more than gold, the jewelry that represented portable fortunes, the elaborate meals, the beautiful homes, all of it was built on systematic human exploitation on a scale that is genuinely horrifying. And here is the complex part, the part that makes this even harder to process. The wealthy Roman women we've been following throughout this night, the women whose beauty routines and fashion and social lives we've explored, they participated in this system. They benefited from it. They were not, for the most part, actively cruel sadists. Many probably thought of themselves as good mistresses, as treating their slaves decently. But decent treatment within a fundamentally unjust system is still participation in injustice. The kindest slave owner is still a slave owner. Some Roman women did form genuine attachments to enslaved members of their household. We have letters where women express grief at the death of a favoured slave. We have evidence of slaves being freed in wills, sometimes given property or money to start new lives. These gestures were real, the emotions genuine, but they do not erase the fundamental wrong. You cannot own another person ethically. The relationship is poisoned from the beginning by the absolute power imbalance. Let me share something specific that breaks my heart every time I think about it. In Pompeii, archaeologists have found the remains of people who died in the volcanic eruption. Among them are slaves who died in positions that suggest they were trying to complete their tasks, even as the disaster unfolded. One set of remains was found in the basement of a house, near the wine storage, apparently a slave who went down to fetch wine and was trapped when the building collapsed. They died doing their job, serving their owners, even in the face of catastrophic natural disaster. What does that tell us about how thoroughly enslaved people were trained to obey, to prioritize their owners' needs, to see their own survival as secondary? The market for slaves was enormous and brutal. Slaves came from multiple sources. War captives, people conquered as Rome expanded its territory, were a major source. Entire populations could be enslaved after military defeats. Children born to enslaved mothers were automatically enslaved, creating a self-perpetuating system. People could be enslaved for debt, and there was a trade in kidnapped people, pirates and raiders capturing victims and selling them into slavery. The human suffering involved in each of these sources is immense, but it was normalized, accepted, fundamental to how Roman society functioned. The buying and selling of enslaved people happened in markets throughout the empire. In Rome, there were specific locations where slave auctions occurred regularly. People were displayed like merchandise, inspected by potential buyers, sold to the highest bidder. Families were routinely separated, children sold away from parents, spouses torn apart. The grief and trauma this caused was simply not considered important by the system that profited from it. And yet, within this horrific system, enslaved people maintained their humanity. They formed relationships, fell in love, created families even knowing those families could be destroyed at any moment. They practiced religion, sometimes their own traditional beliefs, sometimes adopting Roman gods, finding spiritual sustenance where they could. They resisted in small ways when possible, working slowly, breaking things accidentally on purpose, stealing food or small items. Large-scale revolts were rare and almost always ended in mass executions, but they happened. Most famously, the revolt led by Spartacus in 73 to 71 before the Common Era, which terrified Rome and resulted in 6,000 crucifixions along the Appian Way as punishment and warning. The process of manumission, of freeing slaves, did exist in Roman society. Some slaves were freed in their owners' wills, some bought their freedom, some were freed as rewards for long service. Freed slaves, called liberti or freedmen and freedwomen, had a complicated status. They were technically free but still had obligations to their former owners, who became their patrons. They could not hold certain political offices. Their children, however, born after manumission, were full citizens with all rights. This created a pathway, however fraught, from slavery to freedom to full Roman citizenship within 2 generations. Some freed women became quite successful. They opened businesses, accumulated wealth, married free men. There are tombstone inscriptions celebrating accomplished freed women, women who escaped slavery and built new lives. These success stories were possible but rare. Most freed people remained poor, struggling, grateful for freedom but burdened by the lack of resources and the social stigma of having been enslaved. Now, here is something important to understand about wealthy Roman women and their enslaved staff. For women who spent most of their lives at home, who are legally restricted in so many ways, who could not move freely through public spaces without male escort or supervision, their relationships with household slaves were among their most constant human connections. The enslaved women who dressed them, styled their hair, brought their meals, cleaned their rooms, these were the people they saw every day, spoke to regularly, depended on absolutely. A skilled, trusted slave could become almost like a friend, though the power imbalance meant it was never truly friendship in any equal sense. This proximity created complicated emotional bonds. Mistresses might advocate for favoured slaves, protect them from harsh treatment by other family members, reward them with small gifts or privileges. But the same mistress might also punish harshly, might sell a slave who displeased her, might separate slave families without a second thought. The contradiction is stark. You can care about someone and still treat them as property. Roman society made this cognitive dissonance not just possible, but normal. For the enslaved people themselves, navigating these relationships required constant, careful attention. Pleasing your owner meant better treatment, more food, less punishment, possibly eventual freedom. But pleasing one family member might displease another, and the skills required to manage an elite Roman woman's appearance, to create those elaborate hairstyles and perfect makeup, had to be learned somehow. Young slaves were trained by older ones, knowledge passed down through generations of enslaved workers, skills that had market value but that benefited primarily the owners who sold or rented out skilled slaves' labour. As you drift even deeper towards sleep, I want you to hold this image in your mind alongside all the beauty we have explored. Every time you imagine a wealthy Roman woman in her silken jewels, add the dozens of people surrounding her, the hands that dressed her, carried her, fed her, cleaned for her, made her life of luxury possible through their own loss of freedom. The shadow and the light are inseparable. Understanding one requires acknowledging the other. And now, as we move toward the end of our journey together tonight, we turn to something unexpected, something that complicates the picture even further, because despite all the restrictions, despite the legal limitations, despite the patriarchal system that controlled them, some Roman women found ways to claim power, to exercise influence, to achieve things that the system said were impossible. Through education, through wealth management, through patronage and political maneuvering behind the scenes, some women carved out spaces of genuine agency. And that surprising story of hidden power and unexpected achievement is where we go next as our long night together nears its gentle conclusion. There was a woman standing in the Forum in the year 42 before the Common Era, and she was doing something shocking. Hortensia, daughter of the famous orator Hortensius, one of Cicero's greatest rivals, was giving a speech, a public speech. In the Forum Romanum, the political and commercial heart of Rome, where policy was debated and power was wielded, and she was a woman. Women did not speak in the Forum. Women did not participate in political oratory. That was a male space, a male skill, exclusively masculine. But Hortensia did not care. She was furious, and she was educated, and she knew exactly how to use words as weapons. The government had just imposed a heavy tax on the wealthiest women in Rome to fund the ongoing civil war. And Hortensia argued brilliantly that women who could not vote, who could not hold office, who had no voice in government, should not be taxed to support that government's wars. Her speech was so powerful, so eloquent, so undeniably logical that the tax was reduced. A woman, using education and rhetoric, had changed government policy. Think about that. In a society that legally restricted women at every turn, one educated woman with the courage to speak publicly achieved what should have been impossible. This is the side of Roman women's lives that gets forgotten in discussions of beauty and luxury. Yes, they spent hours on appearance. Yes, their lives were constrained by patriarchal structures. But some women, particularly elite women with resources and education, found cracks in the system, ways to exercise genuine power, to influence politics and culture, to achieve things that the legal framework said they could not achieve. And their stories complicate everything we have discussed tonight, because they prove that even within deep oppression, human agency finds ways to assert itself. Let us start with education, because that was the foundation. Formal education in Rome was technically available to both boys and girls from wealthy families, at least at the elementary level. Basic literacy, reading and writing in Latin and sometimes Greek, arithmetic, this was considered appropriate for daughters as well as sons. But education diverged sharply after childhood. Boys continued to advance studies in rhetoric, philosophy, law, preparing for public life. Girls were expected to stop, to focus on domestic skills, preparation for marriage. But some families did not follow this pattern. Some fathers, particularly those from old aristocratic families that valued learning, continued educating their daughters privately. Cornelia Metella, wife of Pompey the Great during the last years of his life, was renowned for her education. Ancient sources describe her as accomplished in literature, skilled at playing the lyre, knowledgeable in geometry, and accustomed to listening to philosophical discussions. This was extraordinary. Philosophy was considered a male pursuit, abstract thinking supposedly beyond female capacity. But Cornelia studied philosophy, understood complex arguments, participated in intellectual discourse. She was praised for this by male historians, which tells us that her level of education was unusual enough to be noteworthy, but not so transgressive as to be condemned. Cornelia, mother of the Gracchi brothers, who were famous reformist politicians in the 2nd century before the Common Era, was even more remarkable. She was educated by the finest tutors her father could provide, and she, in turn, educated her own sons, teaching them rhetoric and philosophy herself rather than relying entirely on hired teachers. Her letters survived long enough to be read by later Romans who praised their style and substance. Here was a woman using education not just for personal enrichment, but actively shaping the next generation of Roman leaders through her teaching. Her sons' political careers, their passion for reform, their oratorical skills, these were at least partially products of their mother's instruction. The poet Sulpicia, who wrote during the Augustan age, is one of the very few Roman women whose literary work survived, though only fragments remain. She wrote love poetry, elegies about her own romantic experiences, in a genre dominated by male voices. Her work was preserved because it was included in collections of poetry by male authors, almost hidden within male literary tradition. But it was there. A woman's voice, a woman's perspective on love and desire and life, recorded and transmitted through centuries. How many other women wrote poetry or philosophy or histories that were not preserved, that disappeared because female authorship was not valued enough to copy and transmit? Education gave these women tools that extended beyond personal cultivation. Educated women could manage complex estates in their husband's absence. They could read contracts, understand financial documents, make informed business decisions. They could participate in cultural patronage, funding poets or philosophers or artists, shaping intellectual life through their choices about who to support, and crucially, educated women could teach their own children, particularly their daughters, creating chains of female education that persisted despite social pressure to limit women's learning. But education alone did not create power. Money did. Property ownership did. And here is where Roman women had a surprising advantage compared to women in many other ancient societies. Roman law, at least by the late Republic and Empire, allowed women to own property independently. Not all women, certainly. Poor women owned nothing. Enslaved women were property themselves. But women of means could own land, houses, businesses, money. And crucially, they could control these assets relatively independently. The legal framework was complicated. Women were technically under guardianship, under the authority of a male tutor throughout their lives. In early Rome, this guardianship was strict, limiting what women could do with their property. But by the 1st century before the Common Era, tutorship had weakened dramatically. Guardians had less and less actual control over female wards. Women could choose their guardians, could change guardians if one was uncooperative, and most importantly, women who had given birth to 3 children, a legal status called ius liberorum, were released from guardianship entirely. They became sui juris, legally independent, able to conduct business, sign contracts, buy and sell property without requiring male permission. Emperor Augustus introduced the ius liberorum as part of his marriage and childbirth legislation, trying to encourage elite women to have more children. But whether he intended it or not, this law gave wealthy women who had borne 3 children extraordinary freedom. They controlled their own wealth completely, and some women used this freedom to become serious economic players. They owned agricultural estates, urban rental properties, manufacturing workshops. They lent money, collecting interest. They bought and sold goods. They were businesswomen, operating in an economy that theoretically excluded them from public commercial life. We have evidence of women owning brick factories, One of Rome's most important industries since building construction consumed enormous quantities of bricks. These were not small operations. A brick factory employed dozens or hundreds of workers, required significant capital investment, generated substantial profits. Women who owned such businesses might never visit the factory themselves. They had male managers run the day-to-day operations. But they owned the assets, collected the revenue, made strategic decisions about investment and expansion. Women also engaged in money lending, one of the most profitable and influential economic activities in Rome. Lending money meant having surplus capital to invest. It meant understanding interest rates and legal contracts. It meant being willing to pursue debtors who failed to repay. Some women became quite wealthy through careful lending practices, accumulating fortunes that gave them independence and influence. Property ownership had another crucial benefit. It gave women something to bequeath. Roman wills could be quite detailed, specifying exactly who received which assets. Women with property could reward loyal slaves by freeing them and leaving them money or land. They could support daughters or granddaughters financially, ensuring the next generation of women had resources. They could fund public works, temples, or monuments, ensuring their names were remembered. One woman, Eumachia from Pompeii, funded the construction of a large public building that bore her name, a permanent monument to her wealth and civic generosity. How many men could claim the same? Religious life offered another avenue for female power and prestige. The Vestal Virgins were perhaps the most visible example. These were priestesses of Vesta, goddess of the hearth, chosen as young girls from elite families to serve for 30 years. During their service, they maintained ritual celibacy, tended the sacred fire that symbolized Rome's continuity, and performed crucial religious ceremonies. In exchange, they received extraordinary privileges. Vestal virgins could own property independently regardless of their age or marital status. They could make wills. They could testify in court, one of very few contexts where women's testimony was legally valid. They had the best seats at public spectacles. They could free condemned prisoners by chance encounter on the street. Their persons were sacrosanct, protected by harsh penalties for anyone who harmed them. The power came with extreme pressure. If a Vestal virgin was accused of breaking her vow of chastity, the penalty was being buried alive. Several Vestals were executed this way during Rome's history, often during political crises when scapegoats were needed. But despite the danger, many families sought to have daughters chosen as Vestals because the position offered power and prestige unavailable in normal women's lives. Other priesthoods were open to women as well. Mystery cults, particularly the cult of Isis imported from Egypt, had female priestesses who conducted rituals and managed temple affairs. These religious roles gave women public visibility, sacred authority and community standing that their otherwise domestic lives did not provide. Political power was officially closed to women. They could not vote, could not hold magistracies, could not serve in the Senate. But unofficial political influence, that was another matter entirely. Women of the imperial family wielded enormous power through their relationships with emperors. Livia, wife of Augustus, was perhaps the most powerful woman in Roman history. She never held office, never commanded armies, was never officially recognized as a political actor. But she advised Augustus, influenced policy, controlled access to the emperor, managed political alliances, and after his death was deified, worshipped as a goddess. Her power was real even though it had no official legal basis. Julia Domna, wife of Emperor Septimius Severus, who we mentioned earlier, received the title Mother of the Senate and the Fatherland, an extraordinary honor for a woman. She presided over a philosophical circle, patronized scholars and writers, influenced legal decisions, and essentially co-ruled the empire alongside her husband and later her sons. When she died in 217 of the Common Era, she had shaped Roman politics and culture for decades, despite having no official position. Agrippina the Elder, granddaughter of Augustus, was recognized for her courage and her political acumen. She accompanied her husband Germanicus on military campaigns, an unusual role for an elite woman. After Germanicus's death, she became a focal point for political opposition to Emperor Tiberius, using her family connections and personal charisma to challenge imperial power. She eventually died in exile, but her willingness to engage in politics, to position herself as a political actor, showed what was possible for women with courage and resources. These imperial women were exceptional, certainly. Most women had no such connections or opportunities, but they demonstrate that the system's restrictions, however harsh and comprehensive, were not absolute. Women found ways through, around, and sometimes directly against the structures meant to contain them. Patronage was another form of power. Wealthy women could become patrons to poets, philosophers, artists, supporting their work financially in exchange for dedications, praise, and influence over cultural production. The poet Martial, for example, dedicated poems to various wealthy women who supported him. These patronage relationships gave women influence over what literature was produced, what ideas were promoted, what artistic styles flourished. Cultural power, the ability to shape the intellectual life of Rome, this was accessible to women in ways that formal political power was not. And sometimes women organized collectively. We discussed the protest against the Oppian Law in the opening of our journey tonight. But there were other moments of female collective action. Women participating in religious festivals asserted public presence. Women gathering at temples created networks of female solidarity. Women using their economic power to influence family decisions about marriages, about business partnerships, about political alliances. This happened constantly at levels too ordinary to be recorded by historians, but no less real for that. What does all of this tell us? It tells us that human beings resist containment, that systems of oppression never achieve total success, that people find ways to claim agency even in deeply unjust circumstances. Roman women were restricted, limited, controlled by laws and customs that treated them as perpetual minors, as property, as beings incapable of full participation in public life. And yet, some women were educated, owned businesses, influenced politics, shaped culture, exercised real power. The contradiction is not evidence that the oppression was not real. It is evidence that human resistance to oppression is equally real. As we approach the very end of our long journey together through the night, as sleep claims you more fully, as the images and stories and facts we've explored begin to blur into dreams, let me leave you with one final thought. The luxury we have spent hours examining, the beauty rituals and jewels and silk and marble and feasts, all of that was real. The oppression, the slavery, the legal restrictions, the violence embedded in the system, all of that was equally real. And the moments of agency, the educated women and the property owners and the political influencers and the religious authorities, those were real too. Roman women's lives contained all of these contradictions simultaneously. They were victims and beneficiaries of injustice. They were restricted and powerful. They were oppressed and privileged. They were human beings navigating impossible situations with whatever tools they could find. And understanding them fully means holding all of these truths at once, acknowledging the complexity, resisting the urge to simplify into heroes or victims, into luxurious lives or miserable ones. The truth is messier, more interesting, more human than either extreme allows. And that, finally, is where we arrive as our night together comes to its gentle close. So what have we learned, you and I, as we have travelled together through this long night in ancient Rome? We have watched the sun rise and set on a world that no longer exists, walked through marble halls that have crumbled to dust, met women whose names echo faintly or not at all through 2,000 years of history. We have seen beauty achieved through suffering, luxury built on exploitation, power claimed despite systematic oppression. We have witnessed contradictions layered upon contradictions until the simple question we began with, what did luxury look like for women in the Roman Empire, has expanded into something far more complex, far more troubling, and ultimately far more human than we might have imagined. And now, as dawn approaches both in our journey and perhaps outside your window, it is time to ask what all of this means, why it matters, what these long-dead women and their impossible lives have to teach us as we live our own. Let me take you back one more time to that image of a Roman woman we started with. Julia, remember her, waking in silk surrounded by marble, her day ahead filled with hours of beauty preparation, social obligations, banquets and baths and political manoeuvring disguised as leisure. We know so much more about her now than we did at the beginning. We know that her face, beautiful as it appeared after hours of work, was painted with poison that was slowly killing her. We know that her silk dress cost more than most people earned in years of labour. We know that her every movement through the day was supported by enslaved people, whose names we will never know, whose suffering made her comfort possible. We know that despite her wealth and privilege, she could not vote, could not own property in her own name unless she had borne 3 children, could not appear in court without a male guardian. And we know that despite all of these restrictions, she might have found ways to exercise real power, through education or business or cultural patronage or sheer force of personality. Julia is not one woman. She is thousands of women, millions perhaps across the centuries of the empire's existence, each unique, each with her own story, her own struggles, her own moments of joy and despair and triumph and defeat. But collectively, they show us something profound about what it means to be human in systems that simultaneously privilege and oppress, about how people create meaning and beauty and identity even within structures designed to limit them. Think about the legacy of all this. What did Roman women leave behind? Not laws in their names, they could not legislate. Not military victories, they could not command armies. Not buildings for the most part, though a few like Eumachia managed to fund public monuments. What they left was more subtle, more deeply woven into the fabric of Western culture. They left beauty standards that influenced art for centuries. The pale skin, the elaborate hair, the draped fabric, these aesthetic ideals appeared again and again in European art through the Renaissance and beyond. They left jewellery designs that modern goldsmiths still reference. Those snake bracelets, those boat-shaped earrings, you can find contemporary versions in high-end jewellery stores today. They left bathing culture, the idea that bathing is not just hygiene but social ritual, that influenced the development of spas and public baths in later European societies. They left educational traditions, the idea that elite women should be educated, should know literature and philosophy and music, even if that education was carefully limited and controlled. The educated Roman matron became a model that later aristocratic European women were measured against, and they left stories, myths about powerful women that both inspired and constrained. Cornelia as the ideal mother, Lucretia as the ideal of chastity, Hortensia as the rare female orator. These stories circulated through medieval and Renaissance culture, providing templates for how women should and should not behave. But perhaps most importantly, they left questions. Questions about what luxury actually means. Is it the silk and jewels and marble? Or is it freedom, autonomy, the ability to make choices about your own life? Roman women had extraordinary material luxury, at least the elite ones did, but they had severely limited freedom. Which matters more? Can you have genuine luxury without genuine freedom? The question is not just historical. We ask it today when we look at wealth inequality, at the difference between material abundance and meaningful autonomy, at systems that provide comfort while denying agency. They left questions about beauty and pain. Roman women endured hours of uncomfortable, often dangerous beauty rituals to achieve looks that society demanded. We still do this, though perhaps our methods are less toxic. How much pain is beauty worth? Who decides what beauty looks like? Why do these standards exist and whom do they serve? When we spend money and time on appearance, are we expressing ourselves or conforming to external pressure? The Roman mirror reflects our own faces back at us across the centuries. They left questions about labour and luxury. Every moment of Roman elite luxury required uncounted hours of enslaved labour. Today we do not have chattel slavery in most of the world, but we have global supply chains where workers in distant countries produce luxury goods under conditions we would find unacceptable if we saw them clearly. The smartphone in your pocket, the clothes you wear, the food you eat, how much invisible labour supports your comfort. How different are we really from the Roman women who benefited from slavery while potentially never examining the moral horror of the system? They left questions about power and restriction. Roman women found ways to claim influence despite legal systems designed to exclude them. What does that tell us about human resistance to oppression? About the inadequacy of any system that tries to completely control human beings? About the cracks that always appear in even the most rigid structures? And what does it tell us about the complexity of privilege, about the way people can be both oppressed and oppressing, both victim and beneficiary, both restricted and powerful? I want you to think about the cosmetae for a moment, those enslaved beauty specialists we have mentioned throughout our journey. They held incredible skill. They knew techniques for creating beauty that took years to learn. They had intimate knowledge of their mistresses, understood their preferences, their moods, their secrets. In some ways they held power, the power of expertise, of closeness, of trust. And yet they were slaves. They could be beaten, sold, separated from their families. Their skills belonged to their owners. This paradox, the coexistence of knowledge and powerlessness, challenges us to think carefully about what power actually means, about how expertise and autonomy are not the same thing. Or think about the jewellery, all that gold and those gemstones we spent so much time discussing. Roman women could own jewellery independently, could control it, sell it, bequeath it. This was real economic power, genuine autonomy in an area where women had very little. And yet jewellery ownership could never compensate for the lack of political rights, the inability to vote or hold office or represent oneself in court. Property rights matter, but they are not sufficient. Both things are true simultaneously. What would a wealthy Roman woman think if she could see our world today? She would be shocked that women vote, hold office, serve as judges and generals and presidents. She would be amazed at women's legal equality, at least in theory, in many modern societies. She would perhaps be surprised at how much of her beauty ritual we still practice, the makeup and hairstyling and perfume, though our methods are safer. She would recognize the jewellery. The love of gold and gems has not changed. She would understand luxury handbags and designer shoes, portable displays of wealth that announce status. She would absolutely comprehend Instagram and TikTok, visual platforms where appearance is curated and displayed and judged. The Roman woman who spent hours preparing her face for public viewing would immediately understand the modern woman who spends hours curating her social media presence. Different tools, same human impulse, and she would probably be dismayed at how much has not changed. Gender inequality, though different in form and degree, still exists. Women still earn less, still face barriers in reaching the highest levels of power, still deal with appearance-based discrimination, still struggle with the balance between autonomy and social expectations. The particular restrictions have changed, but the broader pattern of limitation and resistance continues. As sleep takes you fully now, as your breathing deepens and your mind drifts, let these images fade gently into dreams. The Roman woman in her silk and pearls, walking through marble halls, her beauty achieved through pain, her luxury built on others' suffering, her power claimed despite systematic denial. She was real. She lived and breathed and loved and grieved and died 2,000 years ago, and we've spent this entire night getting to know her, understanding her world, holding space for the contradictions of her existence. She would want you to know, I think, that she was more than her appearance, more than her jewelry, more than the luxury that surrounded her. She was intelligent, capable, resilient. She navigated impossible situations with creativity and strength. She found joy where she could. She loved her children, formed friendships, created beauty, sought meaning. She was fully human in all the complexity that entails. And remembering her, understanding her, acknowledging both her privilege and her limitation, her power and her oppression, this matters. Because how we understand the past shapes how we understand ourselves. The luxury of the Roman woman was real, spectacular, sometimes almost unbelievable in its excess, but it came with costs visible and hidden, acknowledged and denied. And perhaps the real luxury, the kind that matters most, is not silk or gold or marble or pearls. Perhaps it is the freedom to choose your own path, to control your own body and time and resources, to be recognized as fully human with all rights and dignities that entails. Roman women had the former in abundance and the latter only partially, won through struggle, claimed against resistance, maintained through constant effort. We have more of the latter than they did, though the struggle continues. May we use that freedom wisely, with awareness of how precious it is, how recently won, how easily it could be lost. Thank you for travelling with me tonight through this long, strange, beautiful, troubling journey into the past. Thank you for your patience with the complexity, for your willingness to hold contradictions, for your openness to seeing these women as fully human rather than as simple victims or villains. I hope you have learned something, not just facts about Roman history, though we have covered many of those, but something about human nature, about how people create lives worth living even in unjust circumstances, about the complicated relationship between beauty and pain, luxury and exploitation, restriction and power. Sleep well, dear friends. Dream of marble and silk if you like, of gardens and fountains and jewels catching lamplight. Dream of women whose names echo faintly or loudly through history, whose choices and struggles shape the world we inhabit. And when you wake, think about what luxury means to you, what beauty costs, what freedom requires. The lessons of Rome are not just historical curiosities, they are mirrors held up to our own faces, reflecting questions we still need to answer. I will be here again soon with another story, another journey into the past, another opportunity to understand ourselves through understanding those who came before. Until then, Rest peacefully. Let history lull you into dreams, and remember that every person who ever lived, no matter how distant in time, was as real and complex and fully human as you are. Their joys mattered. Their suffering mattered. Their stories matter. Thank you for listening. Good night.